Man, I don't even know where to start with this. I've been kicking around whether or not to even write this down, let alone put it out there for anyone to read. It's just, it messes with you, like really gets under your skin and changes the way you see things. And I'm not the kind of guy who gets spooked easily. I've spent 10 years out in the woods, deep in it, the Pacific Northwest backcountry. I'm talking days from anywhere, sometimes weeks if I'm on a long timber survey or something. Bears, cougars, you name it, I've dealt with them. Never blinked an eye. It's part of the job, part of the territory. You respect the wild, but you don't fear it. That was before all this. I always thought those Bigfoot stories were just that, stories. Old wives' tales, campfire fodder to scare the tourists, loggers yarning after too many beers. I'd heard them all, laughed them off. Everyone did. Even the older guys I worked with, the ones who swore they'd seen things, I figured it was the isolation getting to them, or maybe they just liked a good tall tale. Now I'm not so sure about anything. It started subtly. Nothing concrete at first, just weirdness. I was marking timber stands out near Mount Rainier, way off the trails, where it's just you and the trees and the quiet. Beautiful country, really. Towering pines and cedars, moss hanging everywhere like green beards, the smell of damp earth and pine needles. It's peaceful usually, but this time there was something off. I remember it was a Tuesday, mid-morning. I'd hiked in a good few miles, found a decent spot for lunch, just a fallen log to sit on, opened up my pack. Peanut butter and jelly, apple, water, the usual. I'm sitting there munching on my sandwich, enjoying the sun filtering through the canopy, listening to the birds. Just a normal, peaceful break, and then it happened, this sound like a deep, heavy thump. Not far off, maybe 100 yards, uphill from me. Sounded like a tree falling at first, but wrong. Too sharp, too contained. And then I saw it, a freaking log. Not a small branch, mind you, but a legit log, maybe 10 feet long, a good 1.5 feet thick, just thrown uphill, like someone had picked it up and heaved it. It landed with another heavy thump, rolled a bit and then stopped, wedged against some rocks. I stared at it, sandwich halfway to my mouth, brain short-circuiting. Logs don't just fly uphill on their own. Wind? No, not strong enough, and even if it was, it wouldn't launch a log uphill like that. Landslide? Nothing loose around. Besides, the way it moved, it was like it was directed. I got up, heart starting to thump a bit faster now, and walked over to where the log was. Checked around. Nothing. No sign of anyone. No fresh breaks on the trees. Just this log, out of place, uphill. It didn't make any sense. I tried to rationalize it, came up with all sorts of ridiculous theories in my head. Maybe a weird rockslide effect, a hidden spring pushing it up. Anything to avoid what my gut was starting to tell me, which was, that wasn't natural. That was force. Someone, or something, had thrown that log. I tried to shrug it off. Crazy things happen in the woods, right? Perspective can be off. Sounds can play tricks. But that chill, that little ice pick of unease, had already taken root. It sat there in the back of my mind all afternoon while I worked, measuring trees, marking boundaries. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump a little. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees, feeling watched. Like something was out there, just beyond the edge of my vision. That night I was supposed to camp out in the same general area, finish up the section in the morning and then hike out. I've camped alone hundreds of times, no problem. I actually prefer it. The quiet, the stars, the feeling of being out there on your own. But that night, different story. I set up camp near a small creek, a place I'd used before. Made a fire, cooked some freeze-dried dinner, hung my food bag properly. Bear country, gotta be smart. Everything was normal, routine, until it wasn't. The quiet started getting to me. It wasn't the normal woods quiet. It was heavy. Like all the usual night sounds were gone. No crickets, no owls, no rustling in the underbrush from small animals. Just silence. oppressive silence. My dog, Duke, a German shepherd I take with me sometimes, he's usually hyper-alert. He barks at squirrels halfway across the county, whines at the wind. Everything sets him off. That night, nothing. He was lying right next to the fire, head on his paws, completely still, eyes wide and fixed on the tree line. Not barking, not growling, just frozen. That's when I really started to feel it. Real, honest-to-God fear. Because Duke isn't scared of anything in the woods. He's been out here his whole life. He's fearless. If he was spooked, something was really wrong. Then I heard it. A sound that made my blood run cold. It was a low growl, but not like a bear or a cougar. Deeper, rumbly, and wrong. It sounded like it was coming from further away than it actually was, like it was resonating through the trees, through the ground itself. It wasn't just a sound you heard, it was a vibration you felt in your chest. Duke didn't react to the growl, not visibly. He just tensed up even more, started to tremble slightly. He was looking in the direction of the sound, but he wasn't making a sound himself. He was terrified, silent, which was way more unsettling than if he'd been barking his head off. The growling stopped. Silence again. Then branches started breaking, big branches, snapping like twigs. Closer now, moving through the trees, but not like an animal moving on four legs. This was upright, heavy, deliberate. Each step was a crack, a snap, a crunch that echoed through the still night air. My heart was hammering in my chest. Sweat was beading on my forehead, even though it was cold. I grabbed my pistol, a .45 I always carry for backup in bear country, safety off, finger on the trigger. I pointed it towards the darkness, towards the sounds. "Hello?" My voice came out hoarse, barely a whisper. Stupid, I know, like yelling at whatever the hell was out there was going to make it go away. Silence, just the sound of my own ragged breathing and the crackling fire. Then another growl, closer this time, and then movement. Just glimpses, shadows moving between the trees, too big for a deer, too bulky for a bear. And the way it moved, upright, swaying slightly, arms swinging, that's when I lost it, I think. Pure panic took over. I raised the pistol and fired, just once, into the darkness, towards the sounds, towards the shadows. The gunshot echoed, deafening in the silence, the muzzle flash momentarily lighting up the trees, but I saw nothing, nothing concrete. Silence again. For a long, agonizing moment. I stood there, gun raised, adrenaline pumping, waiting for something to happen, waiting for it to charge, to attack, to I don't know what. But nothing did. Then, a different sound. From down by the creek. A rustling in the undergrowth, like something big was moving through the bushes. I aimed the pistol down that way, breath held, and that's when I saw it. Just for a second, through a gap in the trees across the creek valley. Moonlight was patchy, filtering through the clouds, but for a split second the clouds parted, and a shaft of moonlight hit something moving in the shadows on the opposite slope. It was tall, massive, upright, bipedal. I'm talking 8, maybe 9 feet tall, covered in dark fur or hair, something thick and matted, and it was moving, not running, not charging, just walking, but fast, agile. Its arms were swinging, long, too long, almost down to its knees. Humanoid, but wrong, completely wrong. It was only a glimpse, maybe 2-3 seconds max. Then the clouds closed again, the moonlight vanished, and it was gone, swallowed by the shadows. But I saw it. I know what I saw. And it wasn't a bear, it wasn't a person. It was something else. Something that shouldn't exist. Something that nightmares are made of. I stood there, frozen, gun still raised, staring into the darkness where it had been. Duke was whining softly now, pressed against my leg, trembling like a leaf. I was shaking too, I realized. Shaking all over. I didn't sleep that night. Sat by the fire, gun in my lap, Duke huddled beside me, both of us staring into the darkness, listening to every sound, or lack of sound, waiting for something that never came back. Or maybe it was there, watching just beyond the firelight, I don't know. I didn't dare go look. As soon as it was light enough to see the trail, I packed up camp. Didn't eat, didn't even bother with coffee. Just threw everything in my pack, Duke right behind me, and started hiking out. Fast. Didn't stop until I was back at the truck parked on the logging road, miles away from that campsite. I drove back to town in a daze. Didn't say anything to anyone at work, just called in sick the next day. I couldn't explain it. Wouldn't even know where to begin. And who would believe me? They'd laugh me out of the room. Silas, the level-headed forester, seeing Bigfoot? Yeah, right. But I saw it. I know what I saw. And it changed something in me. The woods. They don't feel the same anymore. That peace, that quiet I used to love, it's gone. Now it's just fear. Every time I go back out there, I look over my shoulder. Every shadow looks a little too tall. Every sound makes me jump. I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, watching, waiting. And the worst part, the absolute gut-wrenching terror. It wasn't just the seeing it. It was the silence afterwards. It just vanished. No explanation, no sled, nothing. Like it was a ghost, a hallucination. But Duke saw it too. I know he did. To this day, I can't explain what happened. I've tried, believe me, tried to rationalize it away, come up with some logical explanation. But there isn't one. Not one that makes sense. And that's what scares me the most, I think. The unknown. The feeling that there are things out there, in the woods, in the dark corners of the world, that we don't understand, that we can't control. Things that are real, but shouldn't be. And sometimes they see us too. And that thought keeps me up at night. Story 2. We lived in base housing, nothing fancy, but it was home. Back then, Fairbanks and the base just kind of melted into the wilderness. You could walk to the edge of the base and bam, you were in woods, just endless Alaskan wilderness. We had this big backyard that backed right up to it. My dad was stationed there, flying something or other. I was a kid, didn't really get it. Just knew we were in Alaska, which felt like the edge of the world to me back then. We had this big, goofy mutt named Buster. He was a good dog, kind of dumb, but loyal as hell. Every night before bed, someone had to take Buster out back for his business. Usually it was my older brother, but tonight, for some reason, it was my turn. I must have complained enough during dinner about something stupid for my mum to decide it was my chore. I remember dragging my feet, pulling on my boots, and complaining the whole time. Outside was pitch black, obviously. No streetlights back there, just snow reflecting whatever dim light there was from the house. Buster was happy as a clam, always excited to go out, even in the freezing cold. He was a husky mix, I think, so cold didn't bother him as much. He'd bound out the door, tail wagging, already sniffing around in the snow. It was quiet, eerily quiet. Usually you'd hear something, even just the wind rustling through the trees at the edge of the yard, or maybe a car driving by on the base roads. But tonight, nothing. Just complete thick silence. It was a heavy silence, if that makes sense. Like the air itself was frozen solid. I clipped Buster's leash on, even though he was usually pretty good off leash in the yard. I just felt weird, uneasy. I couldn't explain it, just a gut feeling, like something wasn't right. The snow crunched under my boots as we walked toward the back of the yard, Buster sniffing at every snowdrift, leaving yellow marks everywhere. Then I heard it, a faint, distant whoop, whoop, whoop sound. At first I thought it was just the wind, playing tricks on my ears, but it got louder, steadier. Helicopter. I figured it was just base traffic, choppers flying in and out all the time. Didn't think much of it at first, but then the sound changed. It was like it got closer, way too fast, and it wasn't just a regular helicopter sound. It was deeper, louder, more powerful, like something big. I looked up, trying to see through the darkness. Nothing, just black sky, maybe a few faint stars if I strained my eyes. Then a light cut through the trees, not just any light, a beam, white-hot and piercing, a spotlight. It sliced through the darkness like a knife, making the snow glow bright white wherever it hit. It was moving, fast, sweeping across the trees at the edge of our backyard. I stopped walking, pulling Buster to a halt. He whined, wanting to keep exploring, but even he seemed a little off, his ears perked up, looking towards the woods. The whoop-whoop sound was deafening now, rattling in my chest, and the spotlight was getting closer, closer, still flashing through the trees. Then it broke through the tree line, and I saw it. A Black Hawk helicopter. Army. Definitely. Black and menacing, even with the white snow around. It was hovering not high up, maybe just above the treetops, right at the edge of the woods behind our yard. The spotlight was blasting from the side of it, cutting into the trees, then sweeping out across the open field behind our house. But it wasn't just hovering normally, it was jittery, erratic. It would dip down suddenly, then jerk back up, then swing sideways, the spotlight dancing around like crazy. It looked like it was searching for something, or chasing something. My heart started pounding. This wasn't normal. Base traffic helicopters didn't act like this, not over base housing backyards. This was something else, something wrong. I felt a cold dread creeping up my spine, colder than the night air. Then something even weirder happened. The helicopter started to move backwards, slowly, still shining the spotlight into the woods. It was backing away from the tree line, out into the field behind our house. And the way it was moving, it wasn't just backing up. It was like it was being pushed back, like something was making it retreat. And then it happened. The trees exploded. Not literally exploded, but it sounded like it. A massive, cracking, splintering sound, like a giant tree trunk snapping in half. And then another, and another, in rapid succession. The ground vibrated under my feet. Buster barked, a sharp, scared bark, and tried to pull back towards the house, his tail tucked between his legs now. The Black Hawk jerked violently upwards, the spotlight swinging wildly, then fixing back on the tree line, or rather, on the space where the trees had just been moments before. Because they weren't there anymore, not in the same way. Something had come out of the woods, something huge. I didn't see it clearly, not at first. It was dark, impossibly dark, even darker than the night. And there was a cloud of snow thrown up into the air by whatever had just burst through the trees. A swirling, chaotic blizzard of snow and ice, but I saw the movement, massive movement. Something towering, something immense was pushing its way out of the trees, tearing through the undergrowth like it was paper. I could hear the snapping of branches, the crunching of snow, the sheer force of something huge moving through the woods. The helicopter's spotlight finally focused on the edge of the trees, right where the destruction was happening. And even through the swirling snow cloud, I saw it then, a shape, just a glimpse distorted by the snow, but enough to make my blood run cold. It was big, impossibly big, taller than the trees, wider than a truck, a dark, hulking shape moving through the snow cloud. And it wasn't walking, it was lumbering. An awkward, clumsy movement, but with immense power behind it. Like something that wasn't meant to move like that, but was doing it anyway, out of sheer force. The ground was shaking now, really shaking, not just vibrating, but actually trembling, like an earthquake, but localized, centered on the edge of the woods. I could feel it in my chest, a deep rumbling. Buster was whining now, a low, whimpering sound, pulling frantically at his leash, trying to get back to the house. I was frozen, though, stuck in place, staring at the chaos unfolding in front of me. The Black Hawk was circling now, wider circles, keeping its distance from the tree line. The spotlight stayed fixed on the dark shape, trying to track it through the snow cloud. And then the snow started to settle, just a little. Enough for me to see more. It wasn't one thing. It was things. Massive, dark shapes moving slowly, deliberately out of the woods. And they weren't shaped like animals, not like any animal I'd ever seen or imagined. They were distorted, wrong, like shadows given form, but clumsy, awkward forms. They were tall, impossibly tall, but also hunched over, dragging themselves forward. And they were indistinct, like they were constantly shifting, their outlines blurring, like looking at something through heat haze. And they were silent. Despite their size, despite the destruction they'd caused bursting out of the woods, they made no sound. No footsteps, no rustling, nothing. Just the crunching of snow where they moved, but that was it. It was like they sucked the sound out of the air around them. The helicopter kept circling, the spotlight now fixed on these things. And then it started firing. Not machine gun fire, not the pop-pop-pop sound you hear in movies. This was different. A deep, heavy thudding sound like a giant hammer hitting something solid, over and over. Dud, 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 dud. I saw flashes of light from underneath the helicopter, bright orange flashes against the black underside, and then I saw impacts, not explosions, but puffs of snow erupting around the dark shapes. The helicopter was shooting something big, really big, but the shapes, they didn't react. Not visibly. They kept lumbering forward, slowly, relentlessly, moving further out into the field. They didn't speed up, didn't slow down, didn't even seem to notice they were being shot at. It was like they were too big, too something, to be affected by whatever the helicopter was firing. The helicopter kept firing, the dud sound echoing across the snow. The spotlight remained fixed on the shapes, but they just kept coming, slowly, silently, relentlessly, out of the woods, into the field, towards nothing, just open snow. I stood there, frozen to the spot, Buster whimpering and pulling, watching this unbelievable scene unfold. Military helicopter firing at something impossibly large and dark, emerging from the Alaskan wilderness. It made no sense. None of it made any sense. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The helicopter stopped firing. The dud sound just cut off. So utterly, terrifyingly real. And I know what I saw. I know what followed me that night on West Nifong Boulevard. And I know deep down that there are things out there, in the darkness, on the edges of what we know, things we can't explain. Things that are best left undisturbed. I've never walked alone at night again, not like that. And I still get that feeling sometimes late at night, when it's quiet and dark outside. That prickle on the back of my neck, that cold weight in the air. And I can't help but wonder if it's still out there, watching, waiting, and honestly I still have no idea what it was. The spotlight remained on the shapes, which were now further out in the field, maybe 50 yards from the tree line. They were still moving, lumbering, but slower now, almost like they were settling. The helicopter just hovered there, silent now, except for the whoop-whoop of its rotors, which sounded almost normal now, almost comforting after the terror of the past few minutes. The spotlight was still on the shapes, but it didn't move, didn't adjust, just stayed fixed. And then the shapes, they just stopped moving, completely. They just stood there, hulking dark masses against the white snow, motionless, like they'd run out of energy or reached some kind of destination, or something else. The silence descended again, thick and heavy, even heavier than before. The helicopter just hovered. The shapes just stood. Buster was still whimpering, but quieter now, pressing himself against my leg. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, feel the adrenaline coursing through me, but I was numb too. Numb with fear, with confusion, with disbelief. And then the helicopter started to rise. Slowly, steadily, it lifted off the ground, still shining the spotlight on the shapes. It climbed higher and higher until it was just a dark shape against the night sky, still the spotlight beam reaching down to the snow. And then it just turned and flew away. Just like that. It banked to the east, away from the base, away from the woods, and just flew off into the darkness. The spotlight beams swung away, sweeping across the field one last time. And then it was gone, swallowed by the night. And then There was just silence again, darkness again. Just me and Buster in the backyard, the snow crunching under my boots, the cold biting at my face, and those shapes standing motionless in the field behind our house. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring at the dark shapes, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. They just stayed there, dark and silent and still. The only sound was Buster's soft whimpering and my own ragged breathing. Finally, slowly, I started to back away, pulling Buster with me. I didn't take my eyes off those shapes. I backed all the way to the house, stumbling a few times in the snow, Buster pulling against the leash, desperate to get inside. I fumbled with the back door handle, finally got it open, and practically dragged Buster inside. I slammed the door shut behind me and leaned against it, gasping for breath, my whole body shaking. My mom was in the kitchen doing dishes. She looked up, startled. "Caleb, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." I tried to talk, but my voice was just a croak. Helicopter, woods, something. I couldn't get the words out. My dad came in from the living room, frowning. "Helicopter? What helicopter? I didn't hear anything." "Dad, there was a Black Hawk in the backyard and in the woods. Something came out big, really big." I was still babbling, trying to make sense of what I'd seen, but the words were just jumbled in my head. My dad went to the back door, peering out the window. "I don't see anything, just snow." "You sure you're okay, kiddo? Maybe you just had a bad dream or something." I shook my head frantically. No, it was real. The helicopter was shooting, and there were things out there, big dark things. He opened the back door and stepped outside, looking around the yard. My mom came to the door too, looking concerned. I followed them, pointing towards the field behind our house. "Out there, past the trees, you have to see them." They looked and looked and looked. They walked out into the snow, further into the yard, scanning the field, shining the flashlight from the house. But they didn't see anything. "Caleb, there's nothing out there," my dad said, turning back to me, his voice gentle, but clearly thinking I was imagining things. "Just snow. And trees, see? Nothing." I stared out at the field, my eyes straining in the darkness, and he was right. There was nothing there, just snow, perfect unbroken white snow stretching out to the dark line of the woods. No dark shapes, no sign of anything ever being there, just nothing. It was like it had all been a hallucination, like I'd dreamt the whole thing standing there in the cold with Buster. But I knew it wasn't a dream. I felt it. The shaking ground, the cold dread, the raw terror. It was real. I knew it was real, but there was no evidence, no footprints in the snow, no broken trees, no sign of the shapes or the helicopter. Nothing. It was like it had all been erased, like it had never happened. My parents were worried, obviously. They thought I'd gotten spooked by something, maybe imagined the whole thing. They made me hot chocolate, tucked me into bed, told me it was just a dream. I tried to tell them again about the helicopter, the shooting, the dark shapes, but they just patted my head and told me to get some sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling in the dark, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. But it was impossible. It just didn't fit. Helicopters don't shoot at nothing. And things that big, that dark, don't just vanish without a trace. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those dark shapes, lumbering out of the woods, silent and menacing, and I heard the dud-dud-dud of the helicopter firing, echoing in the cold Alaskan night. The next morning, the snow was still pristine, untouched. No tracks, no broken trees, nothing to show for what had happened. It was like the whole thing had been wiped clean, like it was never real. I never told anyone about it again. Not really. Not in detail. Who would believe me? A kid who saw monsters in the backyard and helicopters shooting at ghosts? It sounded crazy, even to me looking back. But I know what I saw. I felt it, I heard it, I saw it with my own eyes. Something happened that night. Something terrifying and unexplainable. Something that came out of the Alaskan wilderness and disappeared without a trace. And to this day, whenever I hear a helicopter at night, especially in the dark, I still get that shiver down my spine, that cold, primal fear. Because I know what's out there, lurking in the darkness, just beyond the edge of what we know. And sometimes it comes out to play, and nobody knows why or what it is or where it goes when it's done. It just happens and leaves you wondering if you really saw what you thought you did, even though deep down you know you did. And that's the part that chills you to the bone, even now, all these years later. Story 3. So, this night, it was colder, that crisp fall air you get, but not freezing yet. I'd built a small fire down by the lake, just needed to unwind. Work had been crazy, you know how it gets. Just me, the fire crackling, and the lake all black and still out there. I was just staring into the flames, letting my mind drift when I heard it. At first, I wasn't even sure I heard anything. It was faint, like a thump, but from the water. I tilted my head, listened harder. Silence. Thought maybe it was a fish jumping, though it sounded too heavy for that. More like something solid hitting the water. Then I heard it again. Cut thunk. That's the only way I can describe it. Cut thunk. Like two distinct parts to the sound. The cut part was sharp, like something slicing through the air, and the thunk was heavy, muffled like hitting water. It came from the lake, definitely. Across the water, from the far side where the woods are thickest. It was dark over there, pitch black. My fire only lit up a small circle around me. I strained my ears, trying to place the sound. Cut thunk. Again. And then again, a little faster, cut thunk, cut thunk. I started to get a weird feeling, not exactly scared, more unsettled. It wasn't any animal sound I recognized. Definitely not an animal. It sounded too deliberate somehow, too heavy. I figured it was probably just some natural thing, maybe a tree branch falling into the lake across the way. But it was so rhythmic, that cut thunk sound. Branches usually just crash. This was different. I decided to ignore it. Probably nothing, just lake noises, right? I tried to go back to zoning out, watching the flames dance, but the sounds kept coming, even if they were spaced out. Cut thunk, every few minutes, always from the same direction, across the lake. Finally, I got up and grabbed my flashlight. Not just any flashlight, a really powerful spotlight thing. Battery operated, but it could cut through the darkness. I switched it on and pointed it across the lake, towards where the sounds were coming from. The beam shot out, slicing through the night. The far side of the lake was all woods, thick trees right down to the water's edge. I swept the light back and forth, trying to see anything moving, anything unusual. Nothing, just trees and black water reflecting the beam back at me. Then I saw it. On the little wooden dock I have down by the water, right at my feet almost, something white, sitting on the planks. I lowered the light. It was a rock, a good-sized rock, maybe fist-sized, kind of jagged and white. Quartz, I think, like the kind you see around here sometimes, but this one was cleaner, whiter. I bent down and picked it up. It was cold, heavier than I expected for its size. I turned it over in my hand. Just a rock, right? But then it hit me. How did it get here? It wasn't here before. I would have seen it when I came down to start the fire, and it was bone dry, like it hadn't been in the water at all. It was just placed there. And then the cut-thunk sound came again from across the lake. Right after I picked up the rock, my blood went cold. I stood there, holding the rock, shining the light across the dark water. It was a long way from my dock to the far side of the lake, and woods in between, thick woods. Nobody could just throw a rock that far, especially not in the dark, and land it right on my dock, dry as a bone. It didn't make any sense. It was like something threw it. From way over there, across the lake into the dark woods. But why? And the cut-thunk sounds. Could they be related? My mind started racing. Was someone messing with me? Some kids, maybe? But it felt off. Too deliberate. Too weird. And those sounds weren't kids messing around. They were too heavy, too... something else. I didn't like it. Not one bit. I started to feel that prickly feeling on the back of my neck, like when you know someone is watching you but you can't see them. I looked around, scanning the woods around my property. Nothing. Just darkness and trees swaying slightly in the night breeze. I put the rock down on the dock, very carefully. I didn't want to touch it anymore. I felt uneasy. I suddenly didn't want to be down by the lake anymore. The fire, which had been comforting a few minutes ago, now felt exposed, like it was a beacon drawing attention to me. I put out the fire, quickly, kicking dirt and sand on it until the flames were completely gone, and only embers glowed faintly. Then I grabbed my spotlight and practically ran back to the house, locked the door, checked all the windows. Even though I knew it was probably nothing, just my imagination running wild, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right out there. I spent the rest of the night inside, with all the lights on, listening to the silence. The cut-thunk sounds stopped after I went inside. The silence was almost worse, though. It felt heavy, like something was holding its breath, waiting. I didn't sleep well that night. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside sounded amplified, ominous. I kept thinking about that rock, sitting dry and white on my dock, and those sounds from across the lake. The next day, I tried to act normal. Went to work, did my usual stuff. But the unease was still there, a knot in my stomach. I kept glancing out the windows, expecting, I didn't even know what. Something. When evening came, I dreaded going home. But I had to. It was my house, my life. I told myself I was being stupid, letting a few weird sounds and a rock freak me out. Probably just some animal I hadn't identified. Or maybe those kids from town were messing around. Yeah, that was it. Kids, pranking the old guy by the lake. That's all it was. I got home. It was already getting dark. The sky was that deep twilight blue. I walked down to the lake to check on things. Everything looked normal. The lake was calm, the woods were still. No weird rocks on the dock today. I felt a little relief, honestly. Maybe I had overreacted. Maybe it was just a one-off weird night. I even started to feel a little foolish for being so scared. It's just the woods, right? Animals make noises. Kids do stupid things. I went inside, made dinner, watched some TV, tried to relax. But as the night deepened, that feeling started to creep back in. That sense of something wrong, like the silence was too heavy, too expectant. It was probably around 10, maybe later, when I heard it. This time it wasn't cut-thunk. It was different. It started faint, carried across the water from the same direction as before. It was a sound I can't even describe properly, guttural, like barking. But not like a dog, deeper, raspier, inhuman. It started as a low rumble, like something clearing its throat. Then it grew louder, sharper. Ruff, like a bark, but twisted, broken, painful sounding. It echoed across the still water, chilling me to the bone. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. That wasn't an animal. No animal I had ever heard made sounds like that. It sounded sick, or angry, or both. The barking noises went on, a series of them, rising and falling in intensity. Ruff, ruff. Each sound seemed to claw at the silence, ripping through the night. Fear, real, ice-cold fear, gripped me this time. This wasn't just unease, this was terror. I knew deep down that whatever was making those sounds wasn't natural. It wasn't supposed to exist. I grabbed my spotlight again, hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I went to the back door, heart hammering against my ribs. I hesitated, hand on the doorknob. Do I really want to go outside? Do I really want to see what's making those sounds? But I couldn't stand the not knowing. The sounds were getting louder now, more frequent. Closer, maybe, or just louder because the silence was amplifying them. Rufka! Rufka! I threw open the back door and flipped on the spotlight. The beam shot out across the lake again, searching, sweeping. The woods across the water were still black shadows, impenetrable, but this time something was different. As the light hit the far shore, I saw movement, just a flicker at first, in the edge of the trees. Something dark shifting, just at the edge of the beam, too fast to be a deer, too low to be a bird. I focused the light on that spot, held my breath, and then I saw it, or part of it, just a shape in the shadows. Darker than the surrounding darkness, moving, shifting. I couldn't make out details, it was too far, too dark. But it was there, something was there, and it was moving, and those sounds were coming from that direction. The barking started again, louder now, right as the light hit that area. It felt like a reaction, like the light had triggered it somehow. Ruff! Ga ga ga! Ruff! The sounds were raw, aggressive, filled with something I couldn't name. Hate, pain, something ancient. And then, mixed in with the barks, I heard another sound. Lower, deeper, rumbling, like growling, but not like a dog growling. This was massive. A deep, resonant vibration that seemed to come from the ground itself, through the water. Grrrum, grrrum. My blood turned to ice. I wanted to run back inside, slam the door, hide under the covers and pretend none of this was happening. But I was frozen, stuck there, spotlight shaking in my hand, staring into the darkness across the lake. And then, suddenly, the barking stopped, just cut off, mid-sound. Gone. The growling faded, then stopped too, silence again, but not the same silence as before. This silence was charged, heavy with something unseen, something present. I stood there for what felt like forever, shining the light, listening. Nothing. Just the night sounds, the crickets chirping, the rustle of leaves. Normal sounds, but they felt tainted now, like they were mocking me. I slowly lowered the spotlight. My hand was numb, my arm aching. I stepped back inside, closed and locked the door. This time I didn't turn on the lights. I just sat in the dark by the window, looking out at the lake. The silence stretched on, unbroken. No more sounds, just the darkness and the feeling. That deep, gut-wrenching feeling that something was out there, watching, waiting. I stayed up all night, staring out at the lake. I didn't see anything else, didn't hear anything else. But the fear stayed with me, clinging to me like a shroud. The next morning I went outside. Everything looked normal. Sunlight, birds singing, the lake sparkling. Like nothing had happened the night before, like it had all been a nightmare. But it wasn't. I know it wasn't, because something else was gone. Something I hadn't even realized was part of my everyday life until it vanished. The wildlife. Usually this place is crawling with deer. They wander through my yard all the time, especially in the fall. And the coyotes, you hear them howling every night out in the woods. But that morning, nothing. Silence. No deer tracks in the yard. No coyote howls in the distance. Nothing. It was like everything had left, fled. And it's been like that ever since. The deer are gone. The coyotes are gone. The woods are silent, eerily silent. Even the small animals seem fewer, quieter, like they're all scared of something. I still live here. I haven't moved, but everything's different now. The lake doesn't feel peaceful anymore. It feels watchful. And every night when the darkness comes, I hear that silence, that heavy, charged silence. And I remember those sounds, the cut thunk, the inhuman barks, the ground rumbling growl. I don't know what it was, I don't want to know. I just know something happened out there on the far side of Lake Heart of the Water. Something woke up, or something came here, and it changed everything. And sometimes, late at night when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear it. Faint, distant, carried across the water on the breeze. Just a whisper almost, but I hear it. Rough, rough. And I know it's still out there, waiting. Story 4. Look, I don't really know why I'm even typing this out. Maybe because talking about it still feels impossible. And maybe getting it down in words, even just anonymous words on the internet, might help somehow. It's been 20 years, okay? 20 years since it happened. And I still can see it like it was yesterday, clear as day. Everyone tells me, my wife, my kids, you need to let it go, Dad. It was a long time ago. Easy for them to say. They weren't there. It was supposed to be a fun family vacation. Summer of '04, Lake Three Rivers in Ohio. Never been there before. Dad, Mom, me, my younger sister, and my aunt and uncle, Marta and Lucas. Uncle Lucas was ex-military, Vietnam vet. Real quiet guy, always seemed calm, like nothing could shake him. My Aunt Marta, she was more high-strung but sweet, you know. We rented a houseboat for a week. Think of it, all of us cramped together on that floating box for 7 days. Sounded awful on paper, but actually turned out to be pretty cool. Days were spent swimming, fishing, playing cards, just typical family vacation stuff. The lake was huge, with all these little coves and inlets, really pretty. Water was kind of murky, not crystal clear like some lakes, but still nice for swimming. We'd rented a small motorboat too, a little runabout for exploring. That's where things went south. It was maybe the 3rd day, hot, really muggy even on the water. We'd been cruising around all morning, checking out different parts of the lake. Uncle Lucas and Aunt Marta were in the front. Dad was driving. Mom and my sister were in the back with me. We found this little inlet, kind of hidden, with woods right down to the shoreline. It looked quiet, untouched. Lucas said something like, "Let's pull in here and stretch our legs. Explore a bit." Dad shrugged, killed the engine, and we drifted into this tiny little cove. It was silent there, eerily so. No sounds of other boats, no people yelling, nothing. Just the buzzing of insects and the gentle lapping of water against the hull. The air felt different in there, thicker, heavier. I remember the smell of damp earth and pine needles, kind of sharp. Lucas and Marta jumped onto the shore, said they were going to take a quick walk, maybe find a better fishing spot or something. Dad started rigging up his fishing rod. Mom was reading a book. My sister was splashing her feet in the water. I was just watching the woods. There was something about it, I can't explain it. It felt watched. They weren't gone long, maybe 15, 20 minutes tops. But it felt longer. Then we heard them crashing through the underbrush. Not like someone walking, more like running, panicked running. Dad looked up, confused, and then we saw them burst out of the trees. Lucas was first, face white as a sheet, eyes wide, just wild. Marta was right behind him, her mouth open in a silent scream. They were scrambling towards the boat, tripping over roots, branches whipping at them. "Lucas! Marta! What's wrong?" Dad yelled, jumping up, dropping his fishing rod. They didn't answer, just kept running, their eyes darting back towards the woods. They practically dove into the boat, collapsing in the seats, panting like they'd run a marathon. Lucas was trying to speak, but just gasping for air. Marta was shaking, tears streaming down her face, making tracks through the dirt and sweat. "What happened? For God's sake, tell us," Mom said, her voice tight with worry. Lucas finally got enough breath to speak, but his voice was all shaky and hoarse. "Something in the woods. Jesus Christ, something in the woods." "What? A bear? A snake?" Dad asked, starting to get agitated. He was ex-military too, and he hated not knowing what was going on. Marta started sobbing, louder now, burying her face in her hands. Lucas was staring at the woods, like he expected something to jump out any second. He finally managed to get out. Bigger, bigger than anything. Fur. It stood up. Stood up? I asked, my heart starting to hammer in my chest. I had no idea what he was talking about, but the look on his face, it scared me. It truly scared me. I'd never seen Uncle Lucas like that, never seen him lose his cool, never seen him terrified. He nodded, eyes still fixed on the trees. We went a little ways in, just to see. Found some kind of bed, like something had been sleeping there. Trampled grass, broken branches, a deer bed, Dad suggested, trying to sound reasonable, but his voice was losing its steadiness. Lucas shook his head again, more violently this time. No, not deer. Bigger, much bigger. Then we walked a bit more, got to a clearing, grassy patch, and it was there. What was there, Lucas? Mom pressed, reaching out and touching his arm, trying to comfort him. He turned to her, his eyes still wide and unfocused. It was standing there, just standing, tall, so damn tall, covered in hair, brown hair, or fur, I don't know. You saw a bear standing on its hind legs? Dad asked, still trying to rationalize it, but I could tell he was getting worried now too. No, not a bear. It wasn't bear-shaped. It was like a man, but huge, gigantic, and hairy, all over. He was talking faster now, the words tumbling out of him. It was taller than the grass, taller than everything. I could just see its head and shoulders above the tall grass. Then it moved, turned its head, looked at us. Marta let out a choked sob again. Lucas took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. It saw us, and then it ran, but not like an animal runs. Faster. God, so fast. It went up the hill, through the trees, vanished. You're saying you saw something like Bigfoot? My sister blurted out, her eyes wide with a different kind of fear, a fascinated fear, the kind kids have when they hear ghost stories. Lucas stared at her for a second, like he'd forgotten we were even there. Then he nodded slowly, almost reluctantly. Something like that. I don't know what the hell it was, but it was big, and it scared the living daylights out of me. Marta finally spoke, her voice trembling. It chased us. It chased us down to the boat. Chased you? Dad asked, his voice rising again. Are you sure? Maybe it was just running away in the same direction. No, Marta cried, shaking her head fiercely. I saw it. I heard it. After we started running back here, I heard it behind us, crashing through the trees, coming after us, closer and closer. She started crying harder again, her body shuddering. I felt it behind me, like it was going to grab me. Lucas nodded, confirming her story. I heard it too, big heavy steps, breaking branches. It was coming after us. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I looked at the woods again. Everything was still, silent. But now, it felt different. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was waiting. Like something was still in there, watching us, listening. Dad finally seemed to understand the seriousness of it. He wasn't trying to rationalize it anymore. His face was grim, his jaw tight. Okay, that's it. We're getting out of here. Now. He yanked the starter cord for the motorboat. Nothing. He pulled it again. Nothing. He swore under his breath, yanking harder this time. Still nothing. The engine wouldn't start. Panic started to creep in. It was one thing to be scared in the woods, another to be stranded there, right next to the woods, with something huge and hairy lurking inside. Dad started messing with the engine, checking the fuel line, fiddling with wires. He was good with engines, usually could fix anything. But this time, it was like the damn thing just refused to cooperate. What's wrong with it? Mom asked, her voice edged with panic. I don't know, Dad snapped, frustrated. It was working fine this morning, just won't start now. We were sitting there, drifting closer to the shore, dead in the water, the woods looming over us. The silence felt heavier now, oppressive. I could hear my own heart pounding in my ears. My sister was clinging to Mom, her face buried in her shoulder. Marta was still sobbing. Lucas was staring into the woods, his hand resting on Marta's back, but his eyes were still focused on the dark line of trees. Then we heard it. A sound from the woods. Not crashing this time, not running, something else. A deep guttural sound, like a growl, but bigger, deeper, and somehow almost intelligent, like it was a warning or a challenge. It was low, resonant, and it vibrated in the air, in my chest. It was a sound that went right through you, a primal sound of something huge and powerful. We all froze, every muscle in my body tensed. Even Marta stopped crying. The only sound was that low, rumbling growl from the woods. It went on for a few seconds, then stopped abruptly. Silence again, but this time it wasn't just silence. It was charged silence, like something was about to happen. Dad stopped messing with the engine. He slowly turned around, his face pale and strained. He looked at Lucas, and Lucas looked back at him. They didn't say anything, but they understood. Whatever was in those woods, it was still there. It knew where we were, and it wasn't happy. Then we saw it. Movement in the trees, just a flicker at first, a shifting of shadows high up in the leaves. Then branches started to sway violently, even though there wasn't any wind. Something big was moving through the trees, higher up the slope, parallel to the shoreline, moving closer to us. We could hear the snapping of branches now, louder, more frequent. It wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. It was coming closer. I don't know how to describe the feeling. Pure, raw terror. Like every survival instinct in my body had kicked in at once. I felt like I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't even think straight. Just fear. Cold, paralyzing fear. Then we saw it again, clearer this time. A flash of dark fur between the trees, high up, moving fast. It was keeping pace with us as we drifted along the shore. We were sitting ducks, trapped in a broken boat, with something huge stalking us in the woods. Dad, to his credit, somehow managed to keep his head. He grabbed the oars, the flimsy wooden oars that came with the runabout. "We have to row," he said, his voice strained but firm. "We have to get back to the houseboat." He started rowing awkwardly, desperately, pushing against the water with all his strength. The little boat lurched forward slowly, painfully slowly. Mom and I grabbed the other oar and tried to help, but we were clumsy, out of sync, barely making any progress. My sister was still clinging to Mom, whimpering softly. Marta was huddled in her seat, eyes squeezed shut, praying, I guess. Lucas was still watching the woods, his body tense, ready to react to anything. The sounds in the woods were getting louder, closer, branches snapping, undergrowth crashing, heavy footsteps pounding the earth. We could hear it moving, tracking us, keeping pace with our pathetic rowing. It was getting closer, definitely closer. I could feel it, a presence, something huge and malevolent bearing down on us. Then it broke through the tree line, not right on the shore, but a little ways back, maybe 50 yards, maybe less. But we saw it, clearly this time, standing on the edge of the woods, looking down at us. It was huge, taller than any man, taller than anything I'd ever seen. 8, maybe 9 feet tall, easily. Massive, bulky, covered in thick, dark brown fur. It stood upright, completely upright, like a man, but not a man. Broader, thicker, more powerful looking. Its arms were long, hanging down past its knees. Its head was rounded, kind of cone-shaped with no visible neck. Just this huge, hairy shape, standing there watching us. Its face, I couldn't see much detail, shadowed, covered in fur, but I could see its eyes, 2 eyes, glowing in the shadows, reflecting the little bit of light that made it through the trees. They were intense, burning, intelligent, and angry. They were filled with a cold, furious anger. It just stood there for what felt like forever, staring at us. We were frozen, rowing, forgotten, oars dangling in the water, all of us just staring back at it, paralyzed by fear. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just watched us with those burning eyes. Then, slowly, deliberately, it took a step forward, out of the trees, into the sunlight, onto the grassy bank overlooking the lake. It was even bigger than I'd thought. Its muscles rippled under the fur as it moved. It took another step, and another, coming closer to the edge of the bank, looking down at us in the boat. We were completely exposed now, no cover, no escape, just us, in this tiny boat, and that thing standing on the shore, watching us with hatred in its eyes. And then it roared. Not a growl this time, but a full-throated roar, louder than anything I'd ever heard in my life. It shook the air, it vibrated in the water, it echoed off the trees. It was a roar of pure rage, of primal fury. It was the sound of a predator claiming its territory, warning us to stay away. The sound snapped us out of our paralysis. Dad started rowing again, frantically now, digging the oars into the water, splashing everywhere. We all joined in, rowing like madmen, pulling with every ounce of strength we had. The boat jerked forward, picking up speed, finally moving away from the shore, away from it. We didn't look back. I couldn't look back. I just kept rowing blindly, desperately, pulling and pulling and pulling until my arms burned and my lungs screamed for air. We rowed and rowed and rowed, away from that cove, away from those woods, away from that thing. We didn't stop rowing until we were back out in the main part of the lake, far, far away from that inlet. We rowed until we could see the houseboat, small and distant on the water. Then, and only then, did we collapse, gasping for breath, trembling, soaking wet with sweat and lake water. Dad finally managed to get the engine started. It sputtered and coughed, then roared to life. He slammed the throttle forward, and we sped away from that place as fast as the little boat could go. We didn't talk much on the way back. We were all too shaken, too terrified. Marta was still crying. Lucas was still staring straight ahead, his face grim and pale. My sister was quiet, subdued, her usual bubbly energy completely gone. Mom and Dad were silent, their faces etched with worry and disbelief. And me, I was just numb, empty, like something inside me had broken. We got back to the houseboat, climbed on board, locked the doors. We stayed inside for the rest of the day, curtains drawn, lights off, huddled together like frightened animals. Nobody wanted to talk about it. Nobody wanted to even think about it. We just sat there in silence, listening to the sounds of the lake, every creak of the boat, every rustle of leaves in the trees on the shore. Every sound made me jump, every shadow made me flinch. I kept expecting to see those burning eyes in the darkness outside the windows. We left Lake Three Rivers the next morning, packed up everything, loaded it onto the cars, and drove away, without saying goodbye, without looking back. We never talked about it again, not really, not as a family. It became the thing we didn't talk about, the unspoken trauma that hung between us, a shared secret fear that we all carried, but never acknowledged. And me? Well, I still think about it, all the time. I see it sometimes when I close my eyes. That huge, hairy figure standing on the shore, those burning eyes, that terrifying roar. I know what I saw. I know what we all saw. And I know it wasn't a bear, or a deer, or anything normal. It was something else, something ancient, something wild, something unknown. And it was out there, in those woods, watching us. And sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I still hear that roar in my dreams. And I wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, still terrified, even after 20 years. I still don't go into the woods alone, and I never will again. Story 5. It's hard to talk about, even now. I usually just avoid it, pretend it didn't happen. But sometimes, especially when I can't sleep, it just Replays. Like a bad movie stuck on repeat inside my head. So it was August. August of 2022, yeah. Out here on the coast. Place is supposed to be peaceful, right? We got the ocean, the woods, that whole Bigfoot thing that some people get into around here. But mostly it's just quiet. I like that about it. Still do, I guess. Except, well, after that night, quiet just feels different. Like something's hiding in it. Anyway, that night was just like any other. I had this routine going. Every night after dinner, I'd go down by the old coast road. There's this spot I'd built, a little fire pit off the shoulder, overlooking a couple of valleys that go down to the ocean. Nothing fancy, just rocks piled up so the fire wouldn't spread. I'd usually have a small fire going, just burning off some branches, keep the bugs away mostly, and it was calming. I liked watching the deer come down into those valleys at dusk. They'd graze there, not really bothered by the smoke or anything. It was a good way to unwind before going to bed. That night the moon was almost full, made everything bright, almost like daytime, but a softer light, you know. It was warm, summer night kind of warm, but with that coastal chill starting to creep in as the sun went down. I remember thinking it was a perfect night. Too perfect, maybe. I got down there around 9, something like that. Fire was still going from earlier, just embers mostly, so I tossed a few branches on, got it going again. Sat back on a log I'd dragged over there and waited. Usually within minutes, I'd start seeing the deer. They were pretty regular, but that night, nothing. It was quiet. Unusually quiet. I mean quieter than quiet, like everything was holding its breath. It wasn't just the deer not showing. There were no crickets, no owls hooting, no coyotes yipping way off in the distance, nothing. Usually you hear something, even if it's just the wind in the trees or the ocean rumbling down below. But this was like someone had hit the mute button on the whole world. It started to feel off, really off. I looked around like maybe I'd spooked something, made too much noise getting there. But I hadn't. I was being careful, like always. And it's not like deer or coyotes are that easily spooked anyway. Especially not the ones around here. They're used to people. I got this prickly feeling on the back of my neck. You know that feeling? Like you're being watched, but there's nothing there when you look around. Only this time it was stronger, more insistent. Like something was watching, but it wasn't human or animal or anything I could name. I almost got up to leave then. Just bad vibes, you know? My gut was telling me something was wrong, really wrong, but I'm stubborn, I guess, and a little bit embarrassed to admit I was spooked by nothing. So I stayed. Figured maybe the deer were just late. Maybe something had scared them off earlier, and they'd come out later. Stupid, I know. Should have just trusted my gut and gone home. I sat there for maybe another 10 minutes, just staring out at the valley, listening to nothing. And then I saw it. Way down the road, by the curve, where the streetlight is. Just a single streetlight out there, and it's usually flickering, half-broken thing, but that night it was actually working, throwing out this pale yellow light in a little circle on the road. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, something in the shadows playing with my eyes. But then it moved, slowly. It was tall, really tall. Taller than any person I'd ever seen. At first I thought, okay, maybe it's just some dude way too tall, walking late at night. People do weird things out here sometimes. Tourists get lost, locals go for late-night walks, who knows? But even from that distance, in that weak streetlight, it looked wrong. The proportions were off. It was too thin for how tall it was. And it moved. Awkwardly. Kind of jerky. Not smooth like a person walking. I kept watching it, trying to make sense of it. It was walking along the shoulder of the road, coming towards my direction, slowly, under the streetlight, then past it. And then it just stepped off the road. Not like turning onto a path or anything. It stepped off the edge of the road right into the ditch. Now this ditch isn't just a little dip by the side of the road. It's a proper ditch. Deep, steep banks full of brush and trees. You don't just step into it accidentally. And even if you did, you'd probably stumble, make noise. This thing, it just went, vanished. 1 second it was there, walking along the road. The next second, it was gone, like it had just dissolved into the darkness of the ditch. And that's when the real fear hit me, not just the creepy feeling anymore. Real, cold, stomach-clenching fear. Because people don't just disappear into ditches. Not like that. I stood up, slowly, my heart starting to hammer against my ribs. I kept staring at the ditch, at the spot where I'd seen it disappear. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the dark, silent ditch. The fire was crackling behind me, but I barely even registered it. All my attention was locked on that ditch. And then, something started to move. Not in the ditch, but from inside it, from the darkness of it. Something big, really big. At first I thought it was a bear. We get bears out here sometimes, although they usually stay higher up in the hills. But this was wrong for a bear too. It wasn't crashing through the brush like a bear would. It was quieter, more deliberate, and low to the ground. Whatever it was pushing its way out of the ditch, slowly, silently. And as it cleared the edge of the ditch and came into the moonlight, I finally saw what it was. And I wish I hadn't. I honestly, truly wish I could unsee what I saw that night. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I could have ever imagined. It was monstrous. The closest thing I can compare it to, and even this is way off, is a dog. But not a dog. A giant dog, maybe. But wrong. Horribly, fundamentally wrong. It was huge. I mean, the size of a small car, maybe bigger. And it was low to the ground, but not in a normal animal way. It was sprawled out. Its limbs were too long, too thin, and bent at unnatural angles. It was crawling, or spider walking, I guess, is the only way to describe it. Like a giant spider, but with the shape, vaguely, of a dog. But not really a dog. The head was distorted, too big, skull-like, with these empty sockets where the eyes should have been. Or maybe they were there, but just black, like bottomless pits. And the mouth, it was too wide, stretched into this grotesque grin, filled with rows and rows of teeth that were too long, too sharp, too many. The fur, or whatever it was covering it, was matted, dark, almost black in the moonlight, and greasy-looking, like it had been dragged through mud and oil. And it moved, unnaturally, too fluid, too quick for something that size, like its joints were all in the wrong places, bending the wrong way. It crawled out of the ditch and onto the road, and it just kept crawling, straight across the road, all four limbs moving in this unsettling, spider-like way, propelling this massive body forward with this awful, relentless purpose. It didn't make a sound. No growl, no panting, no claws scraping on the asphalt, just silence, except for the blood pounding in my ears. It was moving across the road, taking up almost the entire lane, just this massive, grotesque thing, crawling, crawling, crawling. And it was heading directly into the valley in front of me, the same valleys where I usually saw the deer. I was frozen. Literally paralyzed. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even breathe properly. My mind just shut down, like it couldn't process what I was seeing, like it was too much, too wrong, too impossible. I just stood there by the fire, watching this abomination crawl across the road and disappear into the shadows of the trees on the other side. It didn't even glance at me, didn't acknowledge my existence. It was like I wasn't even there. Like it was on some mission, some purpose, and I was just air. It was gone in maybe a minute, maybe less. It moved so fast, even though it was crawling. 1 minute it was there, this monstrous shape filling the road, the next, gone, swallowed by the darkness of the trees. And then, the silence was back. But it was a different silence now. Not the expectant silence from before. This was a heavy silence, a suffocating silence. Like the air itself was thick with dread. Slowly, shakily, I started to breathe again. My legs were trembling so badly I could barely stand. I felt cold, clammy, sick to my stomach. I wanted to run as far and as fast as I could. But I was still rooted to the spot, staring at the place where it had disappeared. I stood there for, I don't know how long. Minutes, hours, time just seemed to stop. Finally, I managed to move. Just a small movement at first, taking a step back, then another. Slowly, I backed away from the fire, away from the road, back towards my car. I didn't run. I was too scared to run. Like running would somehow draw attention to me. Like whatever that thing was, it would hear me, smell me, come back for me if I made too much noise. So I just crept, slowly, silently, back to my car. Got in, locked the doors, fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so bad I almost dropped them. Started the engine, put it in drive, and just floored it. Screamed out of there, tires spitting gravel, not even looking back. I drove all the way home, didn't stop, didn't slow down. Got back to my place, locked the doors, double-checked the windows, every door, every lock, every window. Then I just sat there, in the dark, heart still racing, body still shaking, staring out into the darkness, expecting something, anything. I didn't sleep that night, or the next night, or for days after that, really. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it, crawling. That grotesque shape, those empty eyes, that horrible grin. It was burned into my brain. I tried to tell myself it was a dream, that I'd imagined it, that I was stressed, tired, hallucinating, anything. But I knew it wasn't a dream. It was too real, too vivid, too terrifying. I felt it, I saw it, I was there. For months I avoided that road, couldn't even drive that way. Made up excuses to go the long way around if I had to go anywhere near there. And I definitely stopped going out at night. Stopped doing my fire routine, stopped watching the deer, stopped everything that reminded me of that night. People around here, they talk about Bigfoot, about strange lights in the woods, about weird noises. I always just laughed it off. Rational explanations for everything, you know. Misidentified animals, tricks of the light, wind in the trees. I was a skeptic, a believer in facts, in logic, in reason. But after that night, I don't know what to believe anymore, because what I saw, it wasn't natural, it wasn't animal, it wasn't anything from this world. It shattered everything I thought I knew about reality. It cracked the foundation of my understanding of everything. And the worst part is, no one believes me. If I even try to tell them, they look at me like I'm crazy. Or they laugh and say it was just a bear or a coyote or too much beer. And I can't even blame them, because if someone told me this story before I lived it, I wouldn't believe them either. It sounds insane, like something out of a horror movie. But it happened, I know it happened, I was there, I saw it, and it changed me forever. Funny thing is, I almost forgot about it for a while. Or, not forgot exactly, more like pushed it down, buried it deep, tried to ignore it. It still came back sometimes in nightmares, or just as a sudden flash in my mind, but mostly I managed to function, pretend it didn't happen. And then, a few months ago, I went to this conference, work thing, in the city, totally unrelated to anything, just professional development kind of thing. And one of the speakers, he was talking about stress, trauma, PTSD, that kind of stuff. And he mentioned something, just in passing, like an example. He said, spider crawl trauma response. Just those words, spider crawl. And suddenly, it all came flooding back. Every detail, every sensation, the fear, the cold, the smell of the damp ditch, the silence, the sound of the fire crackling, the moonlight, the grotesque shape. Everything. It all hit me at once like a tidal wave. I started to shake. I could feel the blood draining from my face. My hands went cold and clammy again, and I I just started to cry, right there in the middle of this conference, surrounded by hundreds of people I didn't know. Just tears streaming down my face, couldn't stop them. I had to get out of there. Stumbled out of the auditorium into the hallway, just gasping for air, trying to breathe, trying to get control of myself. People were staring, wondering what was wrong, but I couldn't explain, couldn't tell them, not without sounding completely insane. Spider crawl. Just those 2 words, and it all came crashing back. Like the wound was never closed, just scabbed over, and that one phrase just ripped it open again. And now it's all I can think about. Again. The nightmares are back. The fear is back. And the silence. The silence is worse than ever. Because now, when I hear silence, all I hear is it crawling, just waiting in the dark. And I know somehow deep down that it's still out there. Somewhere. Watching. Waiting. And that one day it might come back. And this time, story 6. My dad, Samuel, he's always been into the outdoors. Grew up camping, fishing, hunting, the whole deal. He wanted to pass that on to me, Matthias, his only kid. So, ever since I was little, we've been doing trips together. Nothing too crazy usually, weekend camping stuff, maybe a day hike further out. But this time, last September, he booked us a kayak trip down the Buffalo River in Arkansas. He'd heard about it, said it was beautiful, and we both needed a break. Work had been insane for him, and I was stressed out with college stuff, thinking about the future, all that crap. So yeah, a few days paddling, fishing, camping sounded perfect. We drove down, got to the put-in point, and the river was gorgeous, just like everyone says. Clear water, green trees hanging over the banks, bluffs in the distance. The first day was exactly what we hoped for. Peaceful paddling, a little fishing, sunshine, no other people really. We set up camp that first night on a little gravel bar we found, cooked some dinner, and just chilled out, looking at the stars. Everything was perfect, calm, just nature sounds around us. We fell asleep tired and happy, thinking this was exactly what we needed. Then the second day hit. We were deeper into the canyon by then. The bluffs were getting taller, the trees thicker, the river narrowed in places and the current picked up a bit. It was still beautiful, but the air felt different. I don't know how to describe it. Heavy, maybe, like something was watching. I know it sounds dumb, but that's the feeling I got. We were paddling along, just talking about fishing spots for later, when all hell just broke loose on the riverbank to our right. It wasn't an animal we knew. It was chaotic. Just pure, violent noise exploding out of the trees, branches snapping, bushes crashing, dirt and leaves flying everywhere. Whatever it was big and it was angry, like something had been woken up and was pissed off beyond words. The sound wasn't like a bear, not like a deer crashing through brush, nothing like that. It was raw power, uncontrolled rage tearing through the undergrowth, and the screaming, Jesus Christ, the screaming. It started low, a guttural growl, then it ripped into this high-pitched shriek that sounded like a monkey, but a monkey that was being tortured, just pure agony and fury mixed together. It echoed off the bluffs, amplified in the narrow canyon, and it was like ice water in your veins. I froze, paddle in midair, heart hammering in my chest. Dad stopped paddling too, his eyes wide, staring at the tree line where the noise was coming from. We just sat there in our kayaks, drifting slightly with the current, listening to this unbelievable racket. It moved fast, parallel to the riverbank, crashing through the trees, closer and closer. I remember thinking, bear. But it didn't sound like any bear I'd ever heard. It was too fast, too violent. And that scream, it was inhuman. That's the only word for it, inhuman. Like something was trying to speak, but it was just pure rage coming out, twisted into this animal scream. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped, just cut off. Silence, except for the river flowing and our own breathing, which was way too loud in my ears. We waited, listening, but nothing. Just the woods being woods, birds chirping again like nothing had happened, but everything had changed. The air felt thick, charged with something awful, like we'd just witnessed something terrible. Dad finally spoke, his voice low, almost a whisper. "What the hell was that?" I shook my head, still trying to get my breath back. "I don't know, bear, but that scream..." He just nodded slowly. Didn't sound like any bear I ever heard. He looked at the trees, his eyes scanning the dense woods. Let's keep moving." We started paddling again, but everything was different now. The peace was gone. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. We kept looking at the trees, expecting something to burst out again. We didn't talk much for a while, just paddling, listening on edge. We made it to the campsite we'd planned for the second night, another gravel bar, a little bigger than the first one, tucked against a bluff. It was still early afternoon, but the feeling of unease just kept growing. The sun was starting to go down behind the bluffs, and the shadows were getting long. We set up camp, but it felt different this time. Rushed, not relaxed like the night before. We barely spoke, just went through the motions. Even the fishing felt forced, like we were just trying to act normal. But both of us knew something was wrong. As it got darker, the woods started to come alive with night sounds, but it wasn't the normal night sounds. It started with tree knocks, just bam! A loud, solid thud, like someone hitting a tree trunk with a huge piece of wood. Once, then silence. Then, bam! Another one from a different direction, then another, further away. It wasn't rhythmic, not like woodpeckers, just random, isolated, powerful knocks. We both stopped what we were doing, staring into the dark trees that circled our little gravel bar. The fire was crackling, casting flickering shadows, but beyond the firelight, it was just black. Dad grabbed the flashlight, his hand shaking slightly, and pointed it into the woods. Nothing, just trees, bushes, shadows. "What is that?" I whispered, my voice cracking. He shook his head, his face grim. "Don't know." He listened, his head tilted. Bam! Another tree knock, closer this time. It sounded like it was coming from the bluff right behind us. Then came the rock throws. Small pebbles at first, pattering down on the gravel around us. We looked up at the bluff. Nothing. Then bigger rocks started to fall, bouncing off the gravel, some splashing into the river. They weren't just rolling down. They were being thrown, launched from up high, hitting the ground with force. Someone, or something, was up there on top of the bluff throwing rocks at us. The fear went up another notch, like a cold hand squeezing my gut. This wasn't random anymore. This was directed. Whatever was making those sounds, it was aware of us. It was targeting us. The tree knocks, the rock throws, it felt like intimidation, like it was telling us we weren't welcome here. Then the chattering started, a low, guttural, growling chatter, like teeth clicking and vocal cords vibrating at the same time, deep, menacing, and it seemed to be coming from all around us now. Tree knocks, rock throws, and this horrible chattering sound surrounding us in the dark. Dad grabbed a bigger log and threw it on the fire, flames leaping up, pushing back the darkness a little. He got out his knife, a big hunting knife, and just held it in his hand, staring into the trees. I was frozen, huddled closer to the fire, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. The sounds kept escalating. More tree knocks, closer and louder. The rock throws became more frequent. Bigger rocks now, some the size of softballs, hitting with thuds that made us flinch. The chattering got louder, more aggressive, closer. Then the log snaps started. Crack. A sharp, loud crack that echoed through the canyon like a gunshot. It was the sound of a thick branch or even a small tree trunk snapping in the woods. Too loud for just wind, too deliberate. Crack. Another one, closer to our camp. Crack. Again, even closer. It felt like something was circling us, breaking branches and small trees, getting closer and closer, tightening the circle around us. The fear was overwhelming now, not just fear, but pure terror. We were trapped, surrounded by something unseen, something hostile, and we had no idea what it was or what it wanted. Then the singing started. Or at least, that's the closest thing I can call it. It was a sound that I still can't describe properly. Not human singing, definitely not. Not like any animal call I've ever heard either. It was a series of high-pitched, wavering notes, almost melodic, but twisted, alien, deeply unsettling. Like something was trying to communicate, but its voice, its language was completely wrong, utterly unnatural. It wasn't a song of joy, that's for sure. It was mournful, maybe, but also menacing, like a warning or a lure. That singing sound, it pushed me over the edge. The tree knocks, the rocks, the chattering, the log snaps, all of it was terrifying. But that sound, that unearthly singing, it just broke something inside me. I felt a primal fear, a sense of utter helplessness, like we were facing something ancient and evil, and we had no defense. Dad looked at me, his face pale and streaked with sweat in the firelight. I could see the same terror in his eyes. He knew, we both knew, we had to get out of there. This wasn't just some animal being territorial. This was something else, something darker, something intelligent in a way that was completely alien and terrifying. "We gotta go," he said, his voice hoarse, barely audible above the sounds of the woods. "Now." We didn't argue, didn't hesitate. We started scrambling, tearing down the tent, throwing stuff into dry bags, shoving things into the kayaks. We didn't even think about being quiet anymore. The noise of our frantic packing must have been deafening, but at that point, we just didn't care. We had to get away. The sounds from the woods kept coming, relentless. Tree knocks, rock throws, chattering, log snaps, and that eerie singing all around us, pressing in. It felt like whatever was out there was watching us, enjoying our fear, enjoying our panic. We got the kayaks packed somehow, pushing them into the water, jumping in. We didn't even bother with the fire, just left it burning, a beacon in the darkness for whatever was out there. We paddled like madmen, heading downstream, into the darkness, away from the campsite, away from the sounds. We paddled and paddled as fast as we could, our muscles burning, our lungs aching. The river was dark, we could barely see, just following the faint gleam of the water in the starlight. Branches slapped at our faces, we scraped against rocks. But we didn't stop. We just kept paddling, pushing ourselves further and further away from that place. After what felt like hours, the first hint of dawn started to break in the east. A pale grey line on the horizon, slowly growing lighter. Hope flickered in my chest, a tiny spark in the overwhelming darkness. Maybe, just maybe, we were going to make it. We rounded a bend in the river, and there it was. A rock, flying out of nowhere, slamming into the bluff just above our heads, showering us with dust and pebbles. It was huge, bigger than any of the others, thrown with incredible force. It had come from the top of the bluff, the same bluff we'd camped under. It was like a final shot, a goodbye message. "We're still here, and we could have killed you if we wanted to. Just remember that." That's what that rock felt like, pure, unadulterated malice. We kept paddling, and as the dawn light grew stronger, the sounds from the woods faded behind us. The tree knocks, the rock throws, the chattering, the singing, they all just stopped, as if a switch had been flipped. Silence again, but this time a different silence. A silence filled with the aftermath of terror, a silence that was somehow even more unsettling than the noise had been. We paddled until we were exhausted, until we reached the takeout point later that morning. We dragged the kayaks out of the water, loaded them onto the truck, and just left. We didn't talk much on the drive home. What was there to say? How do you explain something like that? We never went back to the Buffalo River. Dad sold his kayak a few months later. He said he was getting too old for that kind of trip, but I know the real reason. We both know what we heard, what we experienced that night. We can't explain it, we don't understand it, and honestly, I don't think I ever want to. Sometimes at night, when it's quiet and dark, I still hear those tree knocks in my head, that chattering, that unearthly singing, and I feel that same cold, paralyzing fear grip me again. I know we got away, we escaped, but I also know that something out there saw us, marked us, and wanted us gone. And I have no idea why or what it was, and that's the part that really gets to you, the not knowing. It just happened, and then it stopped, and that's it. To this day, I can't make sense of it, and I don't think I ever will. Story 7. We had just moved in. Or, well, we were still moving in. Gareth, that's my husband, he's a hunter and trapper, real outdoorsman type. He'd been building this cabin out in Pinewood for ages, said it was his dream. Honestly, it was pretty isolated, right on the edge of the haunted forest. Yeah, I know, haunted forest sounds like something from a kid's book, but that's what everyone around here calls it. People avoid it, say weird stuff happens there, animals go missing, things like that. I never really paid it much mind, figured it was just old wives' tales. Anyway, we were finally there, me, Gareth and his twin boys, Finn and Owen. They're little terrors, honestly, full of energy, always getting into something. They were excited about the cabin, said it was like living in a real fort. I was trying to be positive for them, for Gareth. I mean, it was rustic, real rustic. Log cabin, way out in the sticks. No phone service, barely any electricity yet. But it was supposed to be our new start, a fresh beginning for us as a family. That day it was sunny, beautiful spring day. I remember thinking how peaceful it was. I was sweeping the porch, just trying to make things feel a little more like home. The boys were out in the meadow, right in front of the cabin, playing some made-up game, running around, yelling like kids do. Shadow, Gareth's dog, a big, goofy lab, was just lounging in the sun nearby, watching them, tail thumping every now and then. It felt normal, perfectly normal. Then it changed. Just like that. Finn and Owen suddenly stopped their game. I looked up, wondering what was wrong. They were staring at the tree line, their little faces all scrunched up, pointing. Then they started backing away, slowly at first, then faster, and then they just bolted. They came tearing across the meadow towards the porch, faces white as ghosts. "Mom! Mom!" Finn was yelling, Owen right behind him, looking like he was about to cry. "What is it? What happened?" I dropped the broom and knelt down, trying to catch them. "The man!" Finn gasped. "In the woods! He's hairy, Mom, really hairy!" "He was watching us," Owen choked out, clutching my shirt. "In the trees! He was hiding!" I thought, okay, kids' imaginations. They get scared of shadows, squirrels, you name it. Okay, calm down. What man? What are you talking about? I tried to sound reassuring, but they were genuinely terrified. It wasn't just kids playing pretend scared. This was different. "Hairy man! He's big!" Finn insisted, eyes wide. "He was behind the trees, peeking." I stood up and looked towards the tree line they were pointing at. The meadow was pretty open, but the woods started right at the edge. Tall pines, thick undergrowth. Shadow lifted her head, ears perked up, and started to growl softly, looking in the same direction. Shadow doesn't growl easily. And then I saw it. Just a flicker at first. Something dark moving between the trees. I squinted, thinking it was just a deer or something, but it was wrong. The way it moved. Too fast. Too deliberate. And then it moved again. A bigger movement this time, and I saw it clearer. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't an animal I'd ever seen or even imagined seeing. It was like a person, but not. It was big, massive and dark, like a shadow moving against the green of the trees. And yeah, the boys were right. It was hairy, covered in thick, dark hair, but not like animal fur. More coarse and human-like, but way too much of it. My heart started pounding in my chest. This wasn't right. This wasn't normal. It moved again, stepping out from behind a thick pine, and I got a clearer look. Oh God, I still see it when I close my eyes. It was tall, way taller than a man, at least 7, maybe 8 feet tall. Broad shoulders, thick arms, and naked, completely naked. I don't know why that stuck with me so much, but it did. The sheer wrongness of it, standing there in the open, in the daylight, like it wasn't even trying to hide anymore. But it was the face, or what I think was its face. That was the worst. It was grotesque, just wrong, hard to describe even now. Like a human face, but stretched, distorted. Heavy brow, sunken eyes that seemed to glint in the shadows even though the sun was bright. A wide, flat nose, almost like a snout, and a mouth that was just a slit, but somehow hungry-looking. And the teeth. I think I saw teeth, long and pointed. It was staring right at the boys. No, not at the boys specifically, but at us, at the cabin, at everything. It was like it was looking and judging, and it didn't like what it saw. Fear, real, raw terror shot through me. This wasn't some animal in the woods. This was something else, something unnatural. "Get inside, now!" I screamed at the boys, my voice cracking. I grabbed the broom, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold onto it. "Run! Inside now!" They didn't need telling twice. They scrambled for the porch steps, tripping over themselves, crying now. Shadow stood up, barking furiously at the creature, a deep, aggressive bark I'd never heard from her before. She was facing the woods, teeth bared, hackles raised. The creature didn't react to Shadow's barking at first. It just kept staring. Then, slowly, its head turned towards us, its eyes locked onto the boys. And then it started to move, fast. Unbelievably fast. It wasn't running like a person runs. It was gliding almost. Long, loping strides, covering ground at an impossible speed. It was moving directly towards us, straight out of the trees and across the meadow. Adrenaline flooded me. My mind went blank except for one thing: protect the kids. I stepped in front of them, raised the broom like it was some kind of weapon, and yelled. I don't even know what I yelled. Just a primal scream of fear and defiance. The creature kept coming. It was close now, impossibly close. I could see details I hadn't noticed before. The matted, filthy hair, the long, dirty fingernails, the way its body seemed too long, too stretched out. It lunged, not gracefully, but with a brutal, animalistic power. It reached for Finn, who was just about to scramble onto the porch. Without thinking, I swung the broom. I swung it as hard as I could, right at its face. I heard a sickening thud, wood connecting with something solid, fleshy. And it worked. For a second, just a split second, it stopped. It recoiled back, making a guttural sound, a kind of roar, but deeper, more animalistic, filled with rage and pain. It stumbled back, its hand going to its face where I'd hit it. That second was all we needed. I shoved the boys ahead of me, practically throwing them onto the porch. Go inside, lock the door, now!" I screamed. They stumbled inside, tripping over the threshold, still sobbing. I backed away, still facing the creature, broom raised, my heart hammering like a drum against my ribs. It was still there, swaying slightly, hand to its face, making that awful guttural noise. Rage poured off it in waves. I could feel it. I scrambled backwards up the porch steps and lunged for the cabin door. I slammed it shut, fumbling for the latch, my hands shaking so violently I could barely get my fingers to work. I got it latched, just as I heard a massive thud against the door, wood splintering. The creature was on the other side. It was trying to get in. Terror choked me. I turned and grabbed the boys, pulling them further into the cabin, away from the door. "Upstairs! Go upstairs! Hide in the bedroom!" I hissed. They ran, scrambling up the rough-hewn stairs, tripping and sobbing. I stayed downstairs, listening. The creature was still there, outside the door. I could hear it moving around, heavy footfalls on the porch, scraping sounds against the logs, and that smell. God, the smell, like rotten meat mixed with something else, something musky and animal. It was awful, gag-inducing. I remembered the shotgun. Gareth had an old shotgun he kept for hunting, leaned up in the corner by the fireplace. I ran to it, hands trembling, and grabbed it. It was heavy, cold in my hands. I'd never held a gun in my life before. Gareth had shown me the basics once, a long time ago, but I barely remembered anything. I fumbled with it, trying to figure out how to load it. Panic clawed at me. What if I couldn't even work it? Suddenly, a window shattered, exploded inwards with a crash. Splinters of glass flew everywhere. I jumped back, heart leaping into my throat. The creature was at the window now, or part of it was. I could see a massive arm reaching in through the broken window frame, long, hairy fingers scrabbling for purchase. "Get away from the window!" I screamed, even though I knew the boys were upstairs. I pointed the shotgun at the window, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it steady. I didn't even know if it was loaded. I just knew I had to do something. Then, another sound. Not from the creature, from Shadow. Barking. Furious, ferocious barking, right outside the window. Not her playful barks. This was the sound of a dog in a fight for its life. I peered cautiously out the broken window. It was hard to see, the light was starting to dim, late afternoon turning into evening. But I saw them, Shadow and the creature. They were locked in a brutal, vicious fight right on the porch. Shadow was snarling, snapping, lunging at the creature's legs, its arms, anything she could reach. The creature was roaring, screaming, trying to shake her off, clawing at her, kicking at her with massive bare feet. It was a chaotic, terrifying ballet of teeth and claws and fur and rage. Shadow was smaller, so much smaller, but she was fearless. She was fighting with everything she had, snarling and biting and refusing to let go. The creature was bigger, stronger, but Shadow was faster, more agile. She was dodging its clumsy blows, snapping and tearing, drawing blood. I could see dark stains spreading on the creature's hairy legs. Hope flickered in my chest. Maybe she could actually drive it away. Maybe she could protect us. But then the creature roared again, a sound of pure fury and frustration. It grabbed Shadow. I don't even know how. It just happened so fast. 1 minute she was attacking its legs. The next it had her. I saw it lift her up, high in the air, dangling in its massive grip. Shadow was yelping, struggling, but it was no use. It was too strong. And then it threw her. It hurled Shadow with incredible force. She went flying through the air, end over end, landing with a sickening thud out in the meadow. A sickening, lifeless thud. The creature stood there for a moment, panting, its chest heaving. Then it turned back towards the cabin, towards the broken window, its eyes, those horrible glinting eyes, fixed on me. Despair washed over me, cold and heavy. Shadow, gone, my fault. I'd brought this down on us, coming out here to this cursed place. Now we were going to die, all of us. But then something shifted. The creature hesitated. It didn't rush the window again. It just stood there looking at me. And I saw something in its eyes, not just rage, something else. Hesitation, confusion, maybe even fear. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and ran. It turned and fled back into the woods, disappearing into the shadows between the trees. It was gone, just like that. Vanished. Silence descended. Heavy, ringing silence, except for the sound of my own ragged breathing and the boys whimpering upstairs. I stood there, frozen, shotgun still pointed at the empty window, listening, waiting. But there was nothing. Only the rustle of leaves, the chirping of birds, the normal sounds of the woods, mocking in their normalcy. Slowly, my legs started to give way. I sank to the floor, still clutching the shotgun, staring out at the darkening woods. Was it really gone, or was it just waiting, watching? I didn't know. I still don't know. After what felt like forever, I finally moved. I had to check on Shadow. I had to see if there was anything I could do. But I already knew. I knew the way she'd landed. I knew it was bad. I went out onto the porch, stepping over the broken glass. The air was cool now, the sun almost completely set. Twilight, the most dangerous time, I realized with a chilling certainty. I walked across the meadow, my legs heavy, numb. I saw her, Shadow, lying still in the grass. I knelt down beside her, my hand shaking as I reached out to touch her. She was cold, still, lifeless. Her eyes were open, staring blankly at the sky. There was blood matted in her fur. Her body was twisted at an unnatural angle. She was gone. My brave, loyal shadow gone. Because of me. Because of that thing. Tears streamed down my face. I just knelt there, sobbing, holding her lifeless body, the shotgun lying forgotten in the grass beside me. The boys started calling from upstairs, their voices thin and scared. But I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I was numb. Then I heard it. The sound of a truck engine in the distance, coming closer. Gareth. He was back. Relief, so intense it almost buckled my knees, flooded through me. He was here. He would know what to do. He would protect us. I stood up, slowly, stiffly, leaving Shadow where she lay. I stumbled back towards the cabin, wiping my face, trying to pull myself together. Gareth's truck pulled into the clearing, headlights cutting through the twilight. He got out, looking tired, carrying a deer carcass slung over his shoulder. He stopped when he saw me, his eyes widening. He dropped the deer carcass to the ground with a thud. "Ilara, what happened here? What's going on?" He looked around, taking in the broken window, the shattered door, the fear on my face. His eyes found Shadow lying still in the meadow. I couldn't speak. I just shook my head, tears streaming down my face again. I pointed towards the woods, towards the darkness where it had gone. And then finally the words came out, choked and broken. It was something in the woods, Gareth, I sobbed. Something terrible. It attacked us. It killed Shadow. He stared at me, his face going pale. He looked at the woods, then back at me. Then he started running towards the cabin, calling the boys' names. And that's the last clear memory I have of that day. Gareth came running out, holding the boys, his face grim, his eyes filled with a fear I'd never seen in him before. He looked towards the woods, his hand instinctively going to the hunting knife at his belt. We stayed in the cabin that night, barricaded the doors and windows as best we could. Gareth kept watch all night, shotgun loaded, staring out into the darkness. We could hear the sounds of the forest, the normal night sounds, but every rustle, every snap of a twig made me jump. Every shadow seemed to move. We left the next morning, packed what we could, didn't even bother to properly close up the cabin, just got in the truck and drove away from Pinewood, away from the haunted forest, and we haven't been back since. I still don't know what it was. I try not to think about it, but sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I close my eyes and I see it again, standing there in the trees, those eyes, that smell, and I know deep down that whatever it was, whatever is in those woods, it's still out there, waiting. Story 8. We drove out to the edge of the logging roads, the truck bouncing over ruts and stones, and then we hiked in, maybe a mile or so, following this little track down to the creek. Karuha Creek wasn't much, really. More like a fast stream than a creek. But it cut through this valley real deep in the woods, the kind of place that just feels isolated, you know? Even in daylight, it felt like you were 1,000,000 miles from anyone. At night, under the trees, it was something else entirely. Dark, heavy dark, the kind that swallows light and sound. We found a spot near the creek bend, flat enough to set up a small camp. Dad was all business, like he always was in the woods. He started unpacking the traps, that familiar metallic clang and clatter echoing a little too loud in the silence. "You get the fire going, Caleb," he said, his breath misting in the cold air, "and get started on that stew." He'd brought rabbit, already dressed, and some potatoes and carrots. Rabbit stew, classic dad-in-the-woods meal. I nodded, trying to sound confident. "Sure thing, Dad." But inside, a knot was already starting to tighten in my stomach. It wasn't just the dark, though the dark was a lot. It was the air, thick and still and, I don't know, charged somehow, like something was holding its breath. Dad took off to check his trap lines, heading deeper into the trees along the creek bank. "Back before dark," he said, not even looking back. And then he was gone. Just the sound of his boots crunching on leaves fading into the woods. I got to work on the fire, gathering dry branches, layering them with pine needles and twigs. My hands were clumsy and cold, and I kept jumping at every snap of a branch, every rustle in the undergrowth. Finally, I got a decent flame going. The fire crackled and popped, throwing out sparks and a little bit of warmth into the growing dusk. It was a small comfort, but at least it was something. Once the fire was burning steady, I started prepping the stew, peeled the potatoes and carrots, cut up the rabbit, got the Dutch oven sitting right over the flames. The smell of the rabbit and vegetables started to mix with the smell of wood smoke, which should have been comforting, normal, but it wasn't, because that's when I noticed it, the smell, not wood smoke, something else, foul, rancid, like something dead, but musky too. It was faint at first, just a whiff on the cold air, but it was definitely there, and it was definitely wrong. I wrinkled my nose, sniffing the air, trying to place it. Rotting meat. Maybe. But it was sharper, more animalistic. It made the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. I kept looking around, trying to see where it was coming from, but there was just the firelight and the deep shadows beyond. And then I saw the tracks. I'd gone down to the creek bank to fetch some water for the stew pot. That's when I saw them in the mud near the water's edge. Footprints. Big footprints. Unbelievably big. And barefoot. They were nothing like human footprints. These were huge, at least twice the size of Dad's boots, which are size 13s. And they were wide, thick, with long, spread-out toes. Toes that looked almost clawed. My heart started to hammer against my ribs. I stared at the tracks, my mind racing, trying to make sense of them. Bear? But bears don't have feet like that. And this smell? Bears don't smell like that. Plus, these prints were clearly bipedal, two-legged, walking upright. Fear, real icy fear, started to seep into me. I'd heard stories, campfire tales, whispers of things in the deep woods, things people didn't like to talk about out loud. Bigfoot stories, sure, everyone's heard them. But they were just stories, weren't they? Just made-up stuff to scare kids around a fire. Except these tracks were real, right there in the mud. I traced one of the footprints with my finger, the cold mud smearing under my touch. They went along the creek bank, heading into the deeper woods, and then back towards our camp. And were there more coming from the other direction too? It was hard to tell in the fading light, but it looked like, yes, tracks all around the creek bank, in a kind of circle around our little camp. I scrambled back to the fire, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I grabbed a big branch and threw it on the flames, sending a shower of sparks up into the dark sky. The fire blazed up brighter for a moment, pushing back the shadows a little, but it felt like just a tiny bubble of light in a vast ocean of blackness. The forest was getting darker, faster than I expected. The sun must have already dipped behind the mountains. The shadows were long and twisted now, playing tricks with my eyes. Every dark shape seemed to move. Every rustle of leaves sounded like something heavy moving closer. Then the noises started. At first, it was just faint cracks and snaps from the woods, normal forest sounds as the night settled in. But then they got louder, sharper, like branches breaking. But not like a deer breaking a branch, heavier, louder, like something big, something clumsy, moving through the trees. And then the rocks started falling. Thump! Just one at first, hitting the ground a little ways from the fire. I jumped, spinning around, heart leaping into my throat, searching the darkness. Nothing, just trees and shadows. Probably just a squirrel, I muttered to myself, trying to sound brave, even to my own ears. But my voice came out thin and shaky, then thump again, closer this time, and then another, thump-thump, two in quick succession, landing just outside the circle of firelight, kicking up dirt and sparks. This wasn't squirrels. These were rocks, small stones, but deliberately thrown or dropped from somewhere up in the trees or from the darkness beyond the trees. Terror clenched my gut. This wasn't just the woods being noisy. This was something else. Something was out there and it was messing with us, with me. I grabbed Dad's rifle. It was a Winchester, a lever-action .30-30, heavy in my hands. I knew how to shoot it, Dad had taught me, but I'd never shot anything bigger than a rabbit with it, and I'd sure as hell never aimed it at whatever was out there. I checked the magazine, made sure it was loaded. The cold metal was slick in my sweaty hands. I held the rifle tight, pointing it towards the darkness, scanning the tree line, my eyes darting back and forth, trying to see through the shadows. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking. "Dad, is that you?" Silence. Only the crackling fire and the rush of the creek, and the heavy, expectant silence of the woods. Then, thump. Another rock, bigger this time, landed right in the fire pit, scattering embers and spitting sparks everywhere. The flames flickered and shrunk back, struggling to stay lit. Panic clawed at my throat. This wasn't random. It was deliberate. It was trying to put out the fire, to leave me in the dark. I scooped up more branches, desperately feeding them to the fire, trying to keep the flames alive, keep the light going. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the wood. The fire flared up again, flickering weakly, casting dancing shadows that jumped and swayed across the trees. And that's when I saw them. Eyes. Just 2 points of light in the darkness, beyond the edge of the firelight. Glowing, reflecting the fire, but glowing from within, like coals burning in the dark. They were high up, maybe 6-7 feet off the ground, and wide apart, wider than a deer's eyes, wider than any animal eyes I'd ever seen. And they were watching me, just watching, unblinking, cold, predatory eyes in the darkness. My breath hitched in my chest, my blood turned to ice. This wasn't a deer, this wasn't a bear, this was something else, something monstrous. I raised the rifle, my hands trembling so violently I could barely hold it steady. I aimed at the glowing eyes, my finger fumbling for the trigger. "Get back!" I shouted, my voice barely a whisper. "Stay away!" The eyes didn't move. They just stared, burning holes in the darkness. I squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared, the recoil slamming into my shoulder, deafening in the stillness of the night. The flash from the muzzle ripped through the darkness, lighting up the trees, showing nothing. Just trees, shadows, darkness. The glowing eyes were gone. Had I hit it? Had I scared it off? Or was it just waiting, watching? My ears were ringing from the gunshot, and the silence that followed was even heavier, more oppressive than before. The fire was still sputtering, weaker now, the flames licking low. And then I heard it. A sound from the woods, not a growl, not a bark, not like any animal I'd ever heard, more like a grunt, but deep, rumbling, and close, too close. It came from just beyond the tree line, maybe 20-30 yards away. Something was moving in the trees, slowly, deliberately, getting closer. Fear overwhelmed me, pure, blind panic. I knew, in that instant, that whatever was out there wasn't going to be scared off by a rifle shot. It wasn't going to go away. It was coming for me. And then, through the trees, I heard another sound. Familiar. Human. "Caleb? Caleb? Is that you shooting?" Dad's voice, coming from the direction of the trap lines. Relief flooded through me, so intense it almost made me weak. Dad! He was back! I wasn't alone anymore. "Dad! Dad, help!" I yelled, my voice hoarse with fear. "Something's out here! Something big!" I scrambled to my feet, still clutching the rifle, and ran towards the sound of Dad's voice, crashing through the undergrowth, stumbling over roots and branches. "Dad! Hurry!" He emerged from the trees, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, swinging wildly. He looked startled, confused. "Caleb? What's going on?" I heard a shot and yelling. Dad, there's something out there, something huge. It threw rocks at the fire. I saw eyes, glowing eyes. I was babbling, stumbling over my words, barely making sense. Dad frowned, his flashlight beam still dancing around, landing on me, then the fire, then the trees. Eyes, rocks. What are you talking about, boy? Did you see a bear? No, not a bear. Something bigger, way bigger. And the tracks, Dad. Giant tracks like nothing I've ever seen. Dad's frown deepened. He lowered the flashlight, looking at me closely. Tracks? Giant tracks? Caleb, you're spooked. It's just the dark playing tricks on you. He sounded skeptical, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, maybe concern. No, Dad, I swear. Come see. The tracks are down by the creek, and the smell. That awful smell. He sighed, shaking his head, but he followed me back to the fire, his flashlight beam cutting a path through the shadows. We reached the creek bank, and I pointed to the mud, still churned up from the giant footprints. There, Dad. Look. See them? Those aren't deer tracks. Those aren't bear tracks. What made those? Dad stopped, his flashlight beam focusing on the muddy ground. He knelt down, peering at the tracks, his face illuminated in the harsh light. He was silent for a long moment, just staring at the footprints in the mud. Then he slowly straightened up, his face pale. Those are big, he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. He shone the flashlight further along the creek bank, then back towards the camp. And there's more of them, all around. His flashlight beam swept over the campsite, and then it stopped, fixed on something just beyond the fire pit. Something missing. The Dutch oven, the heavy cast-iron Dutch oven, filled with rabbit stew, that I'd carefully placed over the fire. It was gone, vanished, just an empty space where it had been. And in its place, more of those giant footprints, pressed deep into the dirt around the fire pit. Dad stood there, frozen, staring at the empty space and the huge tracks. His flashlight trembled in his hand. His skepticism was gone, replaced by something else, something I saw reflected in his eyes. Fear, real, primal fear. Then, from the deep woods, echoing through the trees, we heard it again. The sound that had been moving closer, the deep, rumbling grunt. But this time, it wasn't just a grunt. It was a scream, not a human scream, not an animal scream. Something in between, raw, painful, terrifying, a sound that clawed at your insides and made your blood run cold. It went on and on, a high-pitched, wailing scream that seemed to vibrate through the very air. It wasn't just loud, it was powerful, like it was tearing something inside itself, screaming in agony and rage. Dad didn't move for a second, then his eyes snapped to mine, wide and wild. He grabbed my arm, his grip like iron. "Caleb," he hissed, his voice strained. "We gotta go, now. Leave everything. We run." And we did. We ran, without a word, without looking back. We bolted through the trees, stumbling, tripping, pushing through branches, our hearts pounding in our chests. We ran blindly, desperately, away from the fire, away from the scream, away from whatever was out there in the dark. We didn't stop running until we reached the logging road, miles from the creek. We didn't stop until we were back in the truck, doors locked, engine roaring, tires spitting gravel as we tore out of there. We drove all the way home without speaking, the silence in the cab thick with fear and something else, something unspoken. Something we both knew we'd experienced, but couldn't explain, couldn't understand. We left everything at that campsite, the traps, the stew, the rifle, everything. We just ran and left it all behind. We never went back to Karuta Creek, not ever. And we never spoke about that night again, not to each other, not to anyone else. It was like we both agreed to bury it, lock it away, pretend it never happened. But it did happen. I know it did. I saw the tracks. I smelled the smell. I heard the scream. And I saw those eyes in the dark. To this day, I still can't explain it. I don't know what it was. Some kind of animal? Something else? Something not natural? I just know that something was out there in Karuha Creek that night. Something big, something hungry, something angry, and we got away, just barely. We got away, and that's all that matters, right? But sometimes late at night when it's cold and quiet, I still smell that rancid, musky smell in my dreams, and I still see those glowing eyes burning in the darkness, and I hear that scream, and I wake up in a cold sweat, heart hammering, and I know it's still out there, somewhere in the dark woods, watching, waiting. Story 9. We were driving down this narrow mountain road, the kind where there's barely room for 2 cars to pass, especially with those steep drop-offs on the side. You know the ones. The trees were mostly bare, late fall colors were just fading out, and the air had that sharp, cold bite to it. Pretty, but kind of desolate too. I was looking out the window, not really paying attention to anything specific, just letting my mind wander when I saw them. Deer. A whole group, maybe 5 or 6, moving through the trees on a slope way off the road, maybe 100 yards, maybe more. I pointed them out to Henry, and his whole demeanor just changed, instantly on alert, the hunter in him waking up. He pulled the truck over to the side of the road, not fully off, just enough so we weren't totally blocking the lane, and he was already grabbing his rifle from the back. "Just gonna take a quick look," he said, that excited glint in his eye he gets. Clara and I, we knew the drill. He'd probably be gone an hour, maybe 2 tops. We had Daisy, our Cocker Spaniel, in the back. Sweetest dog in the world, usually super chill. We rolled the windows down a bit, enough for air, and Henry headed off into the woods with his orange vest on, disappearing into the trees almost instantly. That's when Daisy started acting weird. I mean really weird. She started whimpering, which is not like her at all. Daisy hardly ever whimpers. Then it turned into a low growl deep in her chest. I looked back at her, and she was staring out the window, towards the woods Henry had just gone into, her ears perked up, body tense. I thought maybe she'd seen a squirrel or something, tried to calm her down, stroked her fur, told her everything was okay. "It's just Dad, Daisy," I said. "He'll be right back." But she wasn't listening to me. She kept growling, and it was getting louder, more frantic. She started trying to climb over the seats to get to the front, scratching at the console, panting hard. Clara and I exchanged worried looks. Daisy was normally so good in the car, loved car rides even. This was completely out of character. It was like she sensed something was terribly wrong. Then she started really freaking out. She was barking now, sharp, anxious barks, and struggling against her leash. She was practically choking herself, trying to get out of the open window, thrashing around in the back seat like she was in a panic. I reached back to try and soothe her again, to hold her still, but she was just too agitated. It was like a switch flipped in her. I decided maybe getting her out of the car would calm her down. Maybe she just needed to pee or something, even though we'd stopped just before we saw the deer. Anything to make her stop this bizarre behavior. I reached for her leash, clipped it to her collar like I always do, and tried to coax her to the open door. "Come on, Daisy. Come on, girl," I said gently. But she wouldn't budge, just kept pulling back, still growling and barking, eyes wide and wild. I pulled a little harder on the leash, just trying to get her closer to the door, and then it happened. The leash snapped. Just like that, clean break right at the clasp. I swear, I've had that leash for years. It was a sturdy leather one. I never thought it would just break like that. And the second it snapped, Daisy was gone. She leaped out of the open car door and vanished into the woods, exactly the direction Henry went. It was so sudden, so unexpected. Clara and I were just staring at the empty leash in my hand, stunned silent for a second. "Daisy!" Clara yelled, rolling down her window further and calling after her. We could hear branches snapping and leaves rustling as Daisy plunged deeper into the trees. We both got out of the car, calling her name, but she was gone, vanished. Into the same woods Henry had walked into, heading in the same direction. Then we heard it. A whimper. Faint at first, carried on the cold air. Then another, louder. It was Daisy. She was whimpering like she was hurt or scared or both. It was coming from deeper in the woods. Clara started to move towards the trees, wanting to go after her. "Clara, wait," I said, a prickle of unease starting to creep up my spine. Something felt wrong. Daisy's behavior, the leash breaking out of nowhere, the way she just bolted. It was all just too strange. We stood there, listening, trying to pinpoint where Daisy was. Her whimpering was turning into yelping now, more desperate. And then we heard it. A scream. Not Daisy. A high-pitched, agonized scream, unlike anything I've ever heard before. It echoed through the trees, and it wasn't human. It was animal, but not like any animal scream I knew. It was chilling, full of pain and terror, and it cut right through you. Both Clara and I froze. The blood ran cold in my veins. Daisy stopped yelping instantly, like she'd been silenced. The silence after that scream was even worse. The woods suddenly felt different. Heavy, menacing. The air seemed to thicken. We just stood there, staring into the trees, fear gripping us, hearts pounding in our chests. We should have gone back to the car then, I know it now. But we were frozen, paralyzed by what we'd just heard. And then the rocks started falling, just out of nowhere. First, it was just a little pebble, bounced off the roof of the car. "What was that?" Clara whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Before I could answer, another one hit, a bit bigger this time, thudding against the windshield. Then another and another, coming faster now, louder. It was raining rocks. Not big boulders, but rocks, fist-sized, some smaller, some bigger, just pelting down from above, out of the clear sky. There wasn't even any wind. "Get back in the car!" I yelled, panic rising in my throat. We scrambled back into the truck, slamming the doors shut just as a rock hit the hood with a sickening thud, leaving a huge dent. Rocks were hitting the roof, the windows, the sides of the car. It sounded like we were trapped inside a metal drum being hammered by a giant. "What's happening?" Clara cried, her voice shaking. "I don't know," I shouted back, my hands trembling as I fumbled for the keys. I tried to start the car, but my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't get the key in the ignition. Rocks were pounding on the roof, each impact making the whole car shake. I could feel the adrenaline coursing through me, pure terror. Finally, after what felt like forever, I got the key in and turned it. Crank, crank, crank. The engine wouldn't turn over. "No, no, no," I muttered, my voice tight with desperation. I tried again, crank, 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 still nothing. The rocks kept falling, getting heavier now, impacting the car with more force. It was like something was deliberately attacking us, targeting us inside the truck. I tried one more time, flooded with a surge of adrenaline, willing the engine to start. Please, please, please. And then, finally, thank God, the engine sputtered, coughed, and roared to life. I slammed it into reverse, foot down on the gas pedal, and we screeched backwards, tires spitting gravel, rocks still raining down on us, the rearview mirror shattering as a rock slammed into it. I didn't even look where we were going, just slammed the gas and reversed as fast as I could, trying to get away from that spot, away from whatever was throwing those rocks, away from whatever was in those woods. I spun the wheel, jerked the truck around and floored it, heading back down the mountain road the way we'd come, not even thinking about Henry anymore, just pure primal instinct to escape. We were bouncing around in the seats, the truck shaking, rocks still hitting the back of the cab, the sound deafening, terrifying. I just kept my foot down, gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white, tears streaming down my face. Clara sobbing beside me, both of us screaming without making a sound, just desperate to get away, to survive. We rounded a bend, going way too fast, tires squealing, and then we saw him, standing in the middle of the road, right in front of us. Henry. He was walking back towards the road, rifle slung over his shoulder, completely oblivious to what had just happened. He looked totally normal, like he'd just taken a stroll in the woods and was heading back to the car. He hadn't even noticed the rock barrage. He was just walking along, smiling even, probably thinking about the deer he'd tried to hunt. "Henry!" I screamed, slamming on the brakes, the truck skidding, barely missing him. He jumped back, startled, eyes widening in surprise and confusion. "Martha? What the—" he started to say, looking bewildered. Then he saw our faces, saw the dents in the hood and the shattered mirror, the terror in our eyes. Before he could even ask what was going on, wham! A huge rock, bigger than any of the others, slammed down right where he'd just been standing, in the middle of the road. It landed with an enormous crash, sending splinters of asphalt flying. If he hadn't jumped back, it would have hit him for sure. It was no accident. It was deliberate. Henry stared at the rock, then at us, his face going pale, all the color draining out of it. He finally understood. He saw the pure, raw terror in our eyes, the real, unbelievable fear. He didn't ask any more questions. He just ran. He scrambled into the passenger side of the truck, slamming the door shut. "Go! Just go!" he yelled, his voice hoarse with panic. I didn't need to be told twice. I hit the gas again, harder than ever, and we sped away, leaving that cursed place behind us. Rocks still rained down for a few moments, thumping on the truck as we accelerated. But then, as we got further down the road, they stopped, just as suddenly as they'd started. The silence that followed was almost as terrifying as the rocks themselves. We didn't stop driving until we were miles away from Shadow Mountain, until we were back on the main highway, surrounded by other cars, other people, normalcy. We were all shaking, silent, still in shock. Henry kept looking back, out the rear window, like he expected something to be chasing us, something invisible. We never went back to Shadow Mountain. We never talked about hunting there again. We don't even really talk about what happened that day. Sometimes late at night, I still hear that scream in my head, and the sound of those rocks crashing down. I can still feel the terror, the sheer helplessness. I don't know what it was, what was throwing those rocks, what screamed in the woods, why Daisy freaked out like that and disappeared. We never found her, by the way. She was just gone, vanished in Shadow Mountain, and we are never, ever going back to find out. Some questions are better left unanswered. Some places are just wrong, and Shadow Mountain is one of them. I know it in my bones. I just know it. Story 10. Look, I still get goosebumps just thinking about it, and it happened years ago now, back when I was younger and tougher, or at least I thought I was. It was up in Arizona, see? Early 1900s. Timber Creek, small place you wouldn't find on most maps. I was a hunter. Daniel Blackwood, that's me. Made a decent living tracking game, selling hides, meat, survival stuff back then. My wife, Clara, she wasn't too thrilled about the hunting sometimes, especially when it took me away for days. But we needed the money, and there was this bounty, $200, which was a pile of cash back then, for a bear they called Clubfoot. Been causing trouble, taking livestock. Sheriff put out the word. Now, I've hunted bears before, grizzly, black, you name it. Thought $200, piece of cake. Clara, though, she had this feeling, She always did have these feelings. She warned me about Shadow Peak Mountain. Said it was a bad place. "Don't go up there, Daniel," she kept saying. "Something ain't right about that mountain." Said she had nightmares, all sorts of spooky things. I tried to be patient with her, but you know how it is. A man's got to do what he's got to do. $200 wasn't going to fall out of the sky. She brought up this story again, too, about some hermit, some crazy fella who'd been bothering folks down closer to town a while back. Clara swore it wasn't a man, said it was something else, something monstrous. I figured she was just worked up, women's imaginations sometimes run wild. But she was truly scared. Anyway, I told her, "Clara, it's just a bear. Big payday. I'll be back before you know it." Tried to sound confident. Truth is, Shadow Peak Mountain did have a kind of reputation. Folks whispered stories about it, strange things seen up there. But I'm a hunter, not some kid scared of shadows. Before I left, remembering what she'd said about the hermit, I loaded up my shotgun for her. Double-barrel 12-gauge. Said, "Here, Clara, for protection, just in case." more to calm her down than anything else. She barely knew how to use it, never liked guns much. But she took it, her hands trembling a little. That image, Clara holding that shotgun, always stuck with me. I saddled my horse, packed my gear, rifle, traps, food for a few days, and set off early morning. The air was crisp, Arizona sun starting to climb. Ride to Shadow Peak was a few hours. Started out feeling good, you know, hunter's instinct kicking in. But the closer I got to that mountain, the feeling started to change. It wasn't fear, not exactly. More like unease settling in. Like the air itself was getting heavier. Shadow Peak. Even the name sounded ominous. It was taller than the other peaks around, jagged, almost black-looking in certain lights. As I climbed higher, the trees got thicker, darker. Sun barely poked through the canopy in places. It got quiet too, eerily quiet. Usually in the woods you hear birds, squirrels, something. Up there, nothing. Just silence. Unnatural silence. Then I smelled it. Before I even saw it, I smelled it. Rot. Heavy, sickly, sweet smell of decay. Got stronger as I rounded a bend in the trail. And then I saw it. Jesus. I still see it sometimes when I close my eyes. Under these big, twisted pines there was this pile of dead animals. Deer mostly, maybe a few smaller things mixed in, rotting, maggots crawling. It wasn't just a kill site, like a bear dragging its prey somewhere. This was a collection. Dozens of carcasses piled up, half-eaten, some just left to rot. Way too many for any bear, even a big one like they said Clubfoot was. And the way they were arranged, it was almost deliberate, you know. Like someone had placed them there. My horse started acting up then, snorting, tossing his head, stamping his hooves. He could smell it too, the death, and something else, something wrong. He's usually a calm horse, old and steady, but he was spooked, really spooked. I dismounted, rifle in hand, just looking around, trying to make sense of it. This wasn't bear behavior. No bear I ever knew did something like this. This was something else. That feeling of unease turned into something colder, prickling on the back of my neck. That's when I knew I was being watched. Couldn't see anything, but I felt it. Eyes on me, like something was out there in the shadows, studying me. The silence was even heavier now, pressing down. Horse was near frantic, pulling at the reins. I told myself it was my imagination, just nerves getting to me. But my gut, my hunter's instinct, it was screaming at me. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Started to scan the trees, slowly, rifle raised. Heart was pounding. Each shadow seemed to move. Each rustle of leaves made me jump. And then I saw movement. Deep in the shadows, where the trees were thickest, something shifted. Dark shape, hard to make out against the gloom. I raised my rifle, aimed. "Who's there?" I yelled, voice shaking more than I wanted it to. No answer. Just movement again. Closer this time. Whatever it was moving towards me. It stepped out of the shadows then, slowly, deliberately, and I almost dropped my rifle. It wasn't a bear. Not any animal I'd ever seen before. It was vaguely human-shaped, but twisted, wrong, tall, taller than any man, maybe 7, 8 feet. Skin looked pale, grayish, almost like stretched leather. Long arms, too long, hanging down past its knees. Hands clawed, fingers that were too long and thin, and the face. I barely got a glimpse of the face, distorted, shadowy, but I saw eyes, glowed in the dim light, yellow, burning eyes. Terror. That's the only word for what I felt. Pure, cold terror that gripped me, froze me to the spot. But Hunter's training took over somehow. Before I even thought about it, my finger tightened on the trigger. Boom! The rifle roared. Recoil slammed into my shoulder. Saw the creature flinch, but it didn't fall, didn't even stagger. It just kept coming. I worked the lever, pumped another round, fired again and again. 3 shots, point blank, right into its chest. Each shot echoed through the silent woods. Each shot should have dropped anything, bear, mountain lion, anything. But this thing, it just took them, like hitting stone, seemed to barely even notice. It kept moving slowly, deliberately, closing the distance between us, and then it made a sound. God, that sound. I'll never forget that sound. It wasn't a growl or a roar or anything animal. It was a scream, agonizing, high-pitched, like a woman screaming, but twisted, distorted, filled with pain and rage. It cut through the air, chilling me to the bone, making my blood run cold. It was the most unholy, terrifying sound I ever heard. After that scream, it turned, just turned and retreated back into the shadows, moving surprisingly fast despite its size, vanished into the trees like it was swallowed by the darkness. I stood there, shaking, rifle still raised, staring into the woods, waiting for it to come back, heart hammering in my chest like a drum. But nothing. Silence again. Except now, it was different silence, heavy with dread, with something evil. Finally, slowly, I lowered the rifle. My hands were trembling so bad I could barely hold it. I felt sick, empty shells scattered at my feet. 3 shots into that thing, and it just kept walking, like they were pebbles thrown at a wall. I knew then, deep down, that this wasn't Clubfoot. This wasn't any bear. This was something else, something monstrous, something unnatural. Clara's words echoed in my head about the hermit, about something monstrous. Maybe she was right. I didn't even think about the bounty anymore. Didn't think about hunting anything. All I wanted to do was get out of those woods, get away from that mountain. I scrambled back on my horse, practically fell into the saddle, spurred him hard, and he bolted down the trail, stumbling, desperate to escape. I didn't stop him, didn't look back, just rode like hell until I was out of the trees, out of the shadow of Shadow Peak. Rode straight back to Timber Creek, Clara waiting for me, worried sick. She saw my face, knew something was wrong the second I rode into the yard. I didn't tell her everything right away, just said it was bad, said there was something up there that wasn't normal. Next morning, I knew I couldn't just leave it, couldn't just pretend it didn't happen. Needed answers, needed help. I thought of Silas Greystone. He was a tracker, lived out past the edge of town. Quiet man, kept to himself, but everyone said he was the best tracker for miles around. And he knew those mountains, knew them like the back of his hand. If anyone could figure out what that thing was, it was Silas. Went out to his place, small cabin in the woods, smoke curling from the chimney. Knocked on the door. Took a while, but finally he opened it. Silas was weathered, you know, face like leather, eyes sharp and cold like a hawk's. Didn't say much, just stared at me. I told him my story, about Shadow Peak, the carcasses, the creature, the shots, the scream. He listened, didn't interrupt, face expressionless. When I was done, he just looked at me for a long time, silent. Then he said, voice gravelly, "Shadow Peak, eh? Always been a bad place." That's all he said for a while, just stared into the fire. Then he looked up at me, eyes hard. What I swallowed, felt my throat dry. I need your help to find out what that was and how to deal with it," he grunted. "Dealing with things like that ain't cheap." He named a price, a big one, $150, almost cleaned me out. But I was desperate. I knew I couldn't go back up there alone, and I knew I needed to know what it was. "I'll pay it," I said, my voice hoarse. He nodded slowly. "All right, we go tomorrow." Next morning, early again, Silas was ready. He had his own rifle, looked old but well-maintained, and he had dogs. 3 of them, big hounds, looked mean and hungry. He didn't say much, just motioned for me to follow. We rode back towards Shadow Peak, the dogs loping ahead of us, noses to the ground. Silas was quiet the whole way, just watching, listening. The air felt heavy again as we climbed the mountain. I pointed out the pile of carcasses. Silas just grunted, examined them briefly, didn't say anything. We followed the trail I'd made the day before, deeper into the woods. Dogs were getting restless, whining, pulling on their leashes. Silas let them off then. "Find it," he commanded, voice sharp. Dogs took off, baying, disappearing into the trees. We followed behind, rifles ready. The woods were even darker, quieter than before. The silence felt oppressive, like something was watching us, waiting. Then the dogs started barking. Not just barking, but going crazy. Frenzied barks mixed with yelps and growls. Sounded like they'd found something. Silas quickened his pace, me right behind him, heart pounding. We broke into a run, pushing through thick brush. We reached a clearing, a small, dense grove of trees at the very peak of Shadow Peak. And the sound was deafening, pandemonium. Dogs were howling, snarling, barking all at once, mixed with something else. Crashing sounds, like trees breaking, branches snapping. Something big was moving in there, violently. Silas stopped at the edge of the clearing, rifle raised. I stopped beside him, peering into the tangled trees. Couldn't see anything clearly, just movement, shadows, chaos. But I could hear it, hear the dogs fighting, struggling. And then the screams started, dog screams. High-pitched yelps of pain, cut short, one after another. Silence for a moment, then another scream, another yelp, then silence again, each scream tearing through the woods, chilling us to the core. Silas went rigid beside me, face grim. He didn't say a word, just raised his rifle, stepped forward into the grove. "Silas!" I yelled, but he didn't stop. He plunged into the trees, rifle leading the way. Then a single gunshot, loud, echoing in the sudden quiet after the dog screams. And then a sickening sound, like wood splintering, breaking, loud crack like a tree falling. And then silence, complete, utter silence. No dogs, no creature, no Silas, just silence. Terror clawed at me, cold, paralyzing terror. I stood frozen at the edge of the grove, staring into the trees, afraid to move, afraid of what I'd find. But I couldn't just stand there. I had to know, had to see what happened to Silas. Slowly, trembling, I pushed into the grove. The air was thick with the smell of pine and something else, something metallic like blood. Sunlight barely reached into this dense patch. It was dark, shadowy. And then I saw them, the dogs, or what was left of them, scattered around the grove, torn apart, limb from limb, guts ripped out, heads twisted at unnatural angles, carnage, brutal, senseless carnage. I almost threw up. Never seen anything like it. Not even in the wildest animal fight. This was deliberate, malicious. Then I saw Silas's rifle, lying on the ground, broken in half, wood splintered, metal bent, like it had been crushed in someone's hand, or claw. But no sign of Silas. Just the dead dogs, the broken rifle, the smell of blood. Panic surged in me. "Silas!" I yelled, my voice cracking. "Silas! Where are you?" Silence. Only the echo of my own voice coming back at me. I started searching, frantically, stumbling through the trees, looking for Silas, for anything. And then I saw it. Under a fallen log near the edge of the grove, a shape, lying still. Silas? I crawled towards it, heart pounding, and then I saw him. It was Silas, lying on his side, body twisted at an odd angle. I thought he was dead, for sure, the way he was lying, so still, so broken. But then he moved. Just a twitch of his hand. He was alive, somehow. I rushed to him, knelt down beside him. "Silas, Silas, can you hear me?" He didn't answer. Eyes were open, staring blankly up at the trees. Unseeing. Face was ashen, pale as death. And his hair was white, completely white, like snow. It had been dark, grizzled yesterday. Now, white. I shook him gently. "Silas, what happened? What was it?" He blinked slowly. His lips moved, but no sound came out at first. Then he rasped a whisper, barely audible. "Burn the mountain." "What? Burn the mountain? Silas, what are you talking about? What did you see? What did you—" But he didn't answer anymore, just stared blankly, eyes fixed on something unseen, whispering over and over, almost soundlessly, "Burn the mountain." I tried to talk to him, to get him to tell me what happened, but he was gone. Lost somewhere inside himself, catatonic, completely broken. He never spoke coherently again after that. Just "burn the mountain," over and over, sometimes louder, sometimes just a whisper. I somehow got him out of those woods, dragged him back down the mountain, back to town. People helped me when they saw what happened, saw Silas, his white hair, his blank stare. They got scared too, carried Silas back to his cabin. Doctor came, shook his head, said it was shock, trauma, something terrible had broken him. Said he might never recover. Silas never did recover. He lived like that, just staring, whispering, "Burn the mountain," until he died a few years later. Never told anyone what he saw in those woods. Never explained what happened up on Shadow Peak. And me, I never went back up there. Never hunted again. Sold my guns, moved away from Timber Creek, tried to forget, but I can't. I still see it sometimes. The creature, the carcasses, the dead dogs, Silas's white hair, that horrifying scream, and the words echoing in my head, "Burn the mountain." What was it? What happened in that grove? What broke Silas so completely? I don't know. I'll never know. And that's the thing that scares me the most. The not knowing, the mystery, the thought that something monstrous, something unexplainable is still up there on Shadow Peak, waiting. Story 11. Okay, so this happened a while back, but honestly thinking about it still gets under my skin. I've been a backcountry guy my whole life. Grew up camping with my old man, and once I was old enough, I started doing solo trips. Love the quiet, you know? Just me in the woods. Always felt at peace out there, like it was the one place I could really breathe. And I've been in a few hairy situations. Bears sniffing around the tent, mountain lions screaming nearby, the usual wilderness stuff. Never bothered me too much. Part of the deal, right? But this one night, this was different. This messed me up, like for real. It was August, a few years back now. I decided to hike out into Shasta Trinity. Beautiful place, especially up in the higher elevations, but still wild. I picked a spot I'd never been to before, deeper in than usual. Figured I'd push myself a little. Found this little clearing after a solid day's hike, tucked away near a creek, old-growth redwoods all around, the kind that make you feel tiny. Set up camp, got my food bag hoisted up in a tree, a good distance away like always. Standard bear precautions. Evening was beautiful. Crisp, you know, that mountain air. Stars were incredible when it got dark. I sat by the fire for a bit, listening to the creek, just soaking it all in. Felt good to be out there, really good. Eventually, fire died down. I zipped myself into the tent, pretty tired from the hike. Drifted off to sleep pretty quickly. Then I woke up. Not sure what time it was, pitch black outside, obviously deep night. Woke up suddenly like something had pulled me out of sleep. And it wasn't a loud noise or anything, it was a commotion. Over by the food stash tree. Now, I've had critters messing with my food bag before. Raccoons, squirrels, sometimes even a curious bear cub. Usually it's rustling, maybe some clanking pots if something comes loose. This was louder, more forceful, like something bigger was really going at it. I sat up in my sleeping bag, heart starting to thump a little harder. Grabbed my headlamp, kept it off for a second, just listening. Yeah, definitely something over there. There was thrashing, loud rustling of leaves, branches snapping a little, and then a distinct bang, like something heavy hitting the ground. First thought, bear. Definitely a bear trying to get into the food. Not a huge surprise. I mean, that's why we hang the stuff, right? To try and make it harder for them, but this sounded more aggressive than usual. Like whatever it was really determined. I was about to unzip the tent and grab my bear spray, ready to make some noise and scare whatever it was away. That's when everything just stopped. Dead silence. Just like that. The thrashing, the snapping, the rustling, everything. Gone. And it wasn't just the absence of those noises, it was like all the forest sounds just shut off too. No crickets chirping, no owls hooting, not even the creek seemed to be making as much noise. Just heavy, thick silence. That's when I started to get a bad feeling, not just like, oh crap, a bear might be annoying, but a real cold knot in my stomach kind of feeling, like something was wrong, really wrong. I flicked on my headlamp, aiming it towards the food tree, cautiously unzipping the tent just a crack to peek out. Nothing. Just the dark shapes of the trees, the faint moonlight filtering through the leaves. Couldn't see anything moving. But the silence was still there, pressing down. I held my breath, listening harder. Nothing. For a long, long moment, just absolutely nothing. I started to think maybe whatever it was had given up and left. Maybe it was just a raccoon after all, and it had knocked something down and scared itself off. Yeah, maybe that's all it was. Tried to tell myself that, but that feeling, it wouldn't go away. Then I heard it. Not a crash, not a rustle, a scraping sound, like something dragging against the ground, and it was getting closer, definitely coming from outside the tent. It was a soft sound, almost hesitant, but deliberate, like something was testing the ground, figuring out where to step. Not like an animal running or stomping, more careful. And then I realized it wasn't just dragging, it was padding, like soft footfalls on pine needles and dirt. But not 4 feet, 2, definitely 2. And they weren't heavy thuds like boots. They were light, almost digitigrade, if that makes sense. Like the weight was on the front part of the foot, not the heel. Like someone walking on their toes, except it wasn't someone. I knew, deep down, it wasn't. This wasn't a hiker who'd gotten lost. This was something else. The way it moved, the sounds, it felt wrong. The padding sounds were getting closer. They started circling the tent, slowly, deliberately. It was like pacing, like whatever was out there was inspecting the tent, inspecting me. My heart was hammering in my chest now. I could feel it pounding in my ears. I was frozen solid, just lying there in my sleeping bag, headlamp beam shaking in my hand, where I was still pointing it out the slit in the tent zipper. But there was nothing to see, just darkness and the tent wall inches from my face. The sound circled once, slow, measured steps. Padding, scraping, around the whole tent, a complete circle. Then it started again, another circle, slower this time, even more deliberate. Each step seemed to take forever. Like whatever it was savoring the moment. By the second circle, I was breathing in shallow gasps. My muscles were clenched tight, like I was bracing for something, but I didn't even know what. I wanted to scream, to yell, to make noise, anything to break the silence and make it go away. But I couldn't. I was completely paralyzed by fear. The third time it circled, it was agonizingly slow, like it was barely moving, just inching its way around the tent. And on this third circle, the padding sound stopped right beside my head. Just stopped. Silence again, except now it wasn't empty silence. It was filled with presence, like something was right there, inches away from the tent wall, just listening, or watching, or I don't even know what. And then I heard it. The breath. Not a snort, not a huff, not even heavy panting like an animal after running. It was deep, rough, ragged, like someone, or something, with damaged lungs, struggling to draw air. And it was right outside the tent, close enough that I could hear the air rattling in its chest. The breath was slow, drawn out, each inhale and exhale taking forever, and with each breath there was a slight rasping sound, like dry leaves being crushed, and something else, something wet, like phlegm. Disgusting. It was the most unnatural, disturbing sound I have ever heard in my life. It didn't sound like any animal I knew. It didn't even sound fully human. It was something in between, something wrong. The breathing went on for what felt like an eternity, just right there, next to my head. Deep, ragged, wet breaths. And then, finally, the sound of something shifting, a slow, heavy shift of weight, like whatever it was turning its head, or maybe its whole body. And then I felt it, on the tent fabric, right next to my ear, a faint vibration, like something had just barely touched the tent, brushed against it, but not just brushed, scratched, a soft, dry, scratching sound. Across the canvas, right above my head, just one scratch, long and slow, like it was testing the fabric, feeling it, seeing if it could get through. That was it. That broke me. Everything inside me just shut down. I stopped breathing, I stopped moving. I think my heart even stopped beating for a second there. I was just gone, lost in pure, raw terror. I was absolutely convinced in that moment that whatever was outside that tent was not natural, not normal, and it meant me harm. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The scratching stopped. The breathing stopped. The presence faded, slowly, subtly, but it faded, until after another long, agonizing wait, the heavy silence was just silence again. Still thick, still unnerving, but empty of that. I lay there completely paralyzed for what felt like hours. I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't even really feel anything except this bone-deep cold dread. Just waited, listened, hoping against hope that it was really gone. Slowly, very slowly, the forest started to come back to life. A cricket chirped, tentatively, far off in the distance. Then another. Then a nightbird called out. The creek seemed to pick up its murmur again. The silence was still there, but it wasn't as oppressive. It wasn't haunted anymore. Finally, after what felt like forever, the first hint of dawn started to lighten the darkness, a faint grey glow on the horizon. And with that, a tiny spark of something like courage flickered inside me, just enough to let me move. I unzipped the tent, slowly, carefully, peered out. Nothing. Just the grey pre-dawn light, the trees, the mist hanging low in the valley. Looked around the campsite. Nothing disturbed, except the food bag. It was still hanging in the tree, still sealed. But the rope I'd used to hoist it up, thick climbing rope, it was frayed. Not just frayed, but abraded, like something had been clawing at it, pulling at it, trying to break it. And there were deep scratches on the bark of the tree trunk, all around where the rope was tied. Fresh scratches, wood raw and white where the bark had been torn away. Definitely not bare scratches. These were longer, thinner, sharper. I didn't stick around to investigate further. I just packed up my camp as fast as I possibly could, adrenaline pumping now, fear still clawing at me, but with a new edge of urgency. Didn't bother with breakfast. Didn't even fully break down the tent, just shoved everything in my pack, threw it on my back and started walking. Fast. Didn't stop until I was miles down the trail, sunlight fully up, the forest thinning out, the open country starting to appear. I haven't been back to Shasta Trinity since, and I haven't camped alone since either. Not really. I've gone with friends a couple times, but I can't shake that night, can't shake the sounds, the feeling of that thing circling my tent. That breath, that scratch. People tell me it was probably a bear or maybe a mountain lion acting weird. They try to rationalize it, but they weren't there. They didn't hear it. They didn't feel it. And they didn't see those scratches on the tree. I know what I heard, and I know it wasn't any animal I've ever encountered before or since. Sometimes late at night when it's quiet, I still hear that breathing in my head, that slow, ragged, wet breath. And I get that same cold feeling in my gut, like something is still out there, watching, waiting. And I don't know what it was. I honestly have no explanation for it. And that's the part that really scares me even now, the not knowing. The feeling that there are things out there in the wild places, things we don't understand, things that watch us, things that are other. And sometimes I wonder if it's still out there in those deep woods, if it's seen me again, if it remembers me. And that thought still keeps me up at night. Story 12. Okay, so this is something I've been hesitant to talk about for years. Even now, typing it out, it makes my skin crawl all over again. Most folks around here, especially back in '98, you just didn't bring stuff like this up without getting laughed out of the county. But seeing some of the things y'all talk about online, maybe, just maybe, someone else has seen something similar, or at least understands what it feels like to have your whole world tilt on its axis for a few hours. This was rifle season, 1998. Braxton County, West Virginia. Backcountry, real mountains, deep woods. My family's been hunting these parts for generations, knew the land like the back of my hand. I was set up in my usual spot, a good solid tree stand I'd built myself, high up in this big oak, overlooking a decent patch of woods near the Elk River. Always good deer sign there. Sunday evening, first day of the season, and I was settled in, maybe 20 minutes or so after getting comfy, just as dusk was starting to creep in. It was quiet, that kind of woods quiet where you can hear your own heartbeat, you know? Sun was dipping down behind the ridges, turning everything orange and then purple. Leaves were mostly down. November in West Virginia is raw and beautiful at the same time. That crisp, cold air biting at your cheeks even through your layers. I had my rifle rested, safety on, just scanning the tree line, enjoying the peace and quiet. Waiting. That's what hunting's mostly about, waiting. Then I heard it. Rustling. Just off to my left, coming from the deeper woods. My ears perked up right away. Sounded like something moving through the underbrush, snapping twigs. Deer, I figured. Hoped, really. Buck fever was already starting to twitch in my trigger finger. But this was different. It wasn't the light, delicate steps of a deer. This was heavier, clumsier almost, but powerful sounding, more like deliberate. The rustling got closer. Whatever it wasn't being shy about it. It was like a bulldozer crashing through the leaves, but not as fast. Heavy, slow, deliberate. My gut started to tighten up. This didn't feel right. Deer, even a big buck, they're careful, graceful in their own way. This was just brute force moving through the woods. I shifted my rifle slightly, getting it into a better position. Finger still off the trigger, safety still on, but ready. Heart was starting to thump harder now. I was still thinking maybe a bear. Black bears are around, though usually they're hibernating by late November. But the sound wasn't quite bear-like either. Bears lumber, I don't know, this was different. Something about the rhythm of it. The sound was almost to the edge of the woods now, just at the tree line where the deeper shadows were gathering. I strained my eyes, trying to pierce the gloom. The last slivers of daylight were fading fast. My breath hitched in my throat when I saw it. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen, or even imagined seeing in my entire life. It stepped out of the trees and into a patch of that fading light. And it was enormous. Like unbelievably huge, tall, way taller than any man easily, standing on two legs but not like a man, like an ape, but gigantic, covered head to toe in thick matted fur, black, almost oily looking, and clumped with mud. It was just monstrous. My mind just stopped working for a second. I couldn't process what I was looking at. It was like my brain short-circuited. Everything I thought I knew about the woods, about animals, about the world, just went blank. Fear, pure, raw terror just slammed into me. Behind it I saw movement again in the shadows. Another one, smaller but still big. Same black fur, same bulky shape. It was like a smaller version of the first one. A young one, maybe? Or a female, I don't know, but two of them, out there in the woods in Braxton County. The bigger one, the lead one, just stood there for a moment at the edge of the trees. It was maybe 30, 40 yards away from my tree stand, if that. Close, way too close. It turned its head slowly, and that's when I saw its face, or what passed for a face. It wasn't like any ape I'd ever seen in pictures, nothing like a gorilla or a chimpanzee. This was wrong. Deep-set eyes, dark, black as coal, staring straight ahead. No muzzle like a dog or a bear. More flattened, almost human in a horribly distorted way, but with these massive jutting brow ridges. And that fur, covering everything. I couldn't see skin, just black, matted, filthy fur. It started sniffing the air, big, slow sniffs, like it was trying to pick up a scent. And its head started to turn towards my tree stand, slowly, deliberately, like it knew exactly where I was, like it could smell me up there, high up in the oak. Those eyes, they locked onto my stand. I swear to God, it saw me. It knew I was there. Those deep-set black eyes just fixed on my position. I went completely rigid, frozen, couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't even think. Just staring back at this thing. Then it growled, deep, low, rumbling in its chest. Not like a dog growling, not like a bear. Something deeper, something primal. Something that vibrated in my bones, a growl that promised violence, promised something unspeakable. It was looking right at me when it growled, right up at my tree stand. I knew in that moment it was aware of me. It was deciding something. Time seemed to slow down, like everything went into slow motion. I was paralyzed with fear, staring into those black eyes, hearing that growl echoing in the twilight woods. I should have shot. I had a rifle in my hands, a powerful hunting rifle, but I couldn't move, couldn't even lift my rifle. Terror had completely locked me down. Then, from the north, way off in the distance, but clear as a bell in the still evening air, I heard it. A howl, but not a coyote howl, not a wolf howl, not any animal howl I'd ever heard in my life. This was agonized, like something in terrible pain, but powerful too. Full of raw, animal anguish. It was a long, drawn-out wail, chilling to the very core of my being. It cut through the woods like a knife, echoing off the hillsides, made the hair on the back of my neck stand straight up. The big creature, the mother, whatever it was, it reacted instantly to that howl. It snapped its head to the north, towards the sound. It gave another, shorter growl, this time down at the smaller one behind it. Not at me. It was like it was talking to the smaller creature, or ordering it. And then, just as suddenly as they'd appeared, they were gone. The big one turned, lumbering, crashing back into the dense undergrowth, pulling the smaller one along with it. Just vanished. Into the woods, like ghosts, leaving nothing but the sound of snapping branches fading into the distance. Silence descended again, but it wasn't the same silence. It was thick, heavy, oppressive. The air felt charged, electric. The woods felt different, hostile, menacing. Everything had shifted in those few minutes. My reality had just cracked wide open. I stayed frozen in that tree stand, staring at the spot where they'd been, where they'd disappeared into the darkness. Couldn't move, couldn't think straight, just numb with terror. How long I stayed there, I don't know. Felt like hours, could have been minutes. Everything was a blur. Eventually, slowly, like coming out of a nightmare, I started to come back to myself. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely feel my rifle. My legs were like jelly. I was drenched in cold sweat, even though the air was freezing. The image of those creatures, those eyes, that growl, the horrifying howl from the north, it was all burned into my brain, playing on repeat. I knew I had to get out of there. Now. Slowly, carefully, I lowered my rifle, re-engaged the safety a dozen times just to be sure. Then I started to climb down. Every movement was stiff, jerky. My heart was still hammering against my ribs. I kept looking back over my shoulder into the woods, expecting to see them again, to see those black eyes watching me from the shadows. Got to the ground, and I didn't even try to be quiet. I just started walking, fast, then jogging, then running, full out sprinting through the woods. Didn't care about deer, didn't care about hunting, didn't care about anything but getting away from that place, away from those things. tripped over roots, stumbled through brush, branches whipping my face. Didn't stop. Just kept running, adrenaline pumping like fire through my veins. Finally burst out of the woods and into the clearing where I'd parked my truck. Fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so badly I could barely get them in the ignition. Got the truck started, slammed it into gear, and just floored it. Tires spitting gravel as I tore out of there. Didn't stop driving until I was back on the main roads, back in town, back where there were houses, lights, people. Civilization. Got home. Didn't say a word to my family. Just went straight to my room, locked the door, and sat on the edge of my bed, still shaking, trying to make sense of what I'd seen, trying to convince myself it had been a nightmare, a hallucination. But I knew it wasn't. It was real, terribly, horribly real. I haven't been back to those woods since. Not hunting, not hiking, not ever. Sold my tree stand a few years later to some guy moving up from the city. Didn't tell him where it was, just said it was somewhere upriver. Let him figure it out. For years, I kept it to myself. Didn't tell anyone what I saw, figured no one would believe me, or worse, they'd think I was crazy. Just buried it deep down, tried to forget. But you don't forget something like that. It stays with you, in your nightmares, in the back of your mind, always lurking, every now and then, especially in the fall, when the leaves start to turn and the air gets that crisp bite to it. I think about it again, about those woods, about those creatures, and that howl, that god-awful, chilling howl from the north. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind's blowing just right, I swear I can almost hear it again. Faint, distant, but there. And it sends shivers right down my spine. I still can't explain it. Don't know what I saw. Some kind of bear, mutant, something else entirely. I have no idea. And I don't want to know. Some things are better left unexplained. Some things are just out there, in the dark woods, watching, waiting, and sometimes you just catch a glimpse, and your life is never quite the same again. That's all I got. Just wanted to get it off my chest, I guess. See if anyone else out there has seen anything like it. Probably not. Probably just me, out in the woods that day in '98. Story 13. It was supposed to be a break, you know, a real escape from the city noise, the endless concrete, the emails that never stopped. I'd been planning this solo trip for months. Diablo Lake, in the North Cascades. Pictures online looked unreal, like something out of a fantasy movie. Emerald green water, towering mountains, forests that went on forever. I packed my bike, tent, some camping gear, and just took off one Friday afternoon in September of 2015. The ride up was incredible. That highway, winding along the Skagit River, the air getting crisper as I climbed higher into the mountains. By the time I pulled into Colonial Creek Campground, the sun was already starting to dip behind the peaks. Found a spot tucked back in among the trees, pretty secluded, which was exactly what I wanted. Unloaded the bike, set up my tent, one of those small one-person deals, and got a fire going. The smell of pine was heavy in the air, and the lake down below was like glass, reflecting the last light of the day. Honestly, it was perfect. Just sitting there by the fire, watching the stars start to pop out, feeling that quiet that you only get when you're miles away from everything. I cooked some dehydrated chili, gourmet I know, and just relaxed, listening to the crackle of the fire and the sounds of the woods settling down for the night. A couple of times I heard rustling in the underbrush, probably just squirrels or something. Nothing to worry about. I'm usually not one for early bedtimes, but the day's ride and the fresh air had worn me out. I banked the fire, crawled into my sleeping bag, and just closed my eyes. Must have been close to midnight by then. Everything was still and dark, the kind of dark that feels heavy, you know. The forest at night is a different beast altogether. All those familiar daytime sounds are gone, replaced by, well, just a different kind of quiet, a watchful kind of quiet. I drifted off to sleep pretty quickly, but it couldn't have been more than a couple of hours later when I woke up. Not gradually, but instantly, like something had snapped me awake. At first, I couldn't figure out what it was. My heart was pounding a little faster than normal, and I felt uneasy, like that feeling you get when you know someone's watching you, even if you can't see them. Then I heard it. It wasn't a sound I'd ever heard before, not like any animal I knew. It started far off, from across the lake, and at first it was low, almost like a rumble. But it quickly grew, rising in pitch and volume until it became this howl. But not like a wolf howl, deeper, more resonant, more inhuman. It cut through the silence of the night, echoing off the mountains around the lake. And it wasn't just loud, it was penetrating, like it went right through you, vibrated in your bones. I sat bolt upright in my sleeping bag, heart hammering now, adrenaline starting to flood my system. I was trying to make sense of it, trying to identify it, but my mind just kept drawing a blank. It was a sound of pure, raw power, but also something else, something that made the hair on my arms stand on end. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Silence again. But it wasn't the same silence as before. This silence was thick with tension, charged. I held my breath, listening, straining my ears for any other sound. Maybe it was just an animal, a cougar or something, making a weird noise. But it hadn't sounded like any cat I'd ever heard, not even on nature documentaries. It felt different, older, wilder. Then it came again, the same howl, maybe even louder this time, and again from across the lake. It was like a challenge or a call. I don't know how to describe it, but it felt like it was meant for something, for someone. And then, before I could even really process that, I heard the answer. This one was closer. From up the hillside, behind my campsite, somewhere in the dense trees above me. It started low, almost a growl, and then it rose, mirroring the sound from across the lake, but this time, angrier, more aggressive. It built and built, the pitch climbing, the volume exploding until it wasn't a howl anymore. It was a roar, a deafening, earth-shattering roar that echoed through the entire valley. It wasn't just loud, it was physical. I could feel it vibrating in my chest, rattling my teeth. That was when real fear started to set in. This wasn't normal. This wasn't some animal in distress or territorial dispute. This was something else, something primal, something terrifyingly out of place. The two calls went back and forth across the lake and from the hillside above me for what felt like forever. But I know now, looking back, it was probably only about 20 minutes, maybe less. But in those 20 minutes, time seemed to stretch and distort. Each howl was a hammer blow. Each answering roar was like a physical wave of dread washing over me. I huddled deeper in my sleeping bag, trying to make myself smaller, trying to disappear. My mind was racing, trying to find some explanation, any explanation, but all I could come up with was nothing. There was nothing in my experience, nothing I'd ever heard or read that could account for what was happening. And then the howls stopped. Again, sudden silence, but this time it was different. This time it wasn't tense quiet. This time it was expectant, like something was about to happen. And it was. I heard it before I felt it, a low thrumming in the ground. At first, I thought it was my imagination, my nerves on edge. But it got stronger, a deep vibration that resonated up through the ground, through the tent floor, right into my body. And it was getting closer. I realized then, with a sickening lurch in my stomach, that the thing on the hillside, the one that had roared, was coming down the slope towards the lake, towards my campsite. The vibrations got stronger with every second, turning into distinct footfalls. Heavy footfalls, massive footfalls. Each step sent shivers up my spine. This wasn't like a deer or a bear crashing through the undergrowth. This was something heavier, something bigger, something moving with deliberate, unstoppable force. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, too terrified to move, barely daring to breathe. I could hear the snapping of branches, the rustling of leaves getting closer and closer, and with each sound, the footfalls got louder, the ground vibrating more intensely. It was like a freight train was barreling through the forest, but a freight train that weighed, I don't even know, 100 tons. It was definitely coming straight for my camp. There was no mistaking it. Whatever it was headed right for me. My mind was screaming now, panic clawing at my throat. Fight or flight kicked in, but both options seemed impossible. Fight what? I couldn't even imagine what was. Flee where? Into the darkness, into the woods, with that thing coming after me? I just lay there, paralyzed, as the sound grew louder and louder. It was right outside my tent now. I could hear heavy breathing, ragged and deep. I could smell something musky, wild, feral. The tent fabric bulged slightly, as if something massive was pressing against it. I closed my eyes tight, squeezing them shut, wishing I could just disappear, become invisible. And then it happened. It exploded. Not literally, but it felt like an explosion of sound, of force, of pure, unadulterated terror. It unleashed another roar right outside my tent, no more than a few feet away. But this wasn't the same roar from the hillside. This was different, closer, more visceral. It was raw, guttural, a sound ripped from the deepest part of something ancient and monstrous. It was so loud, so close, that it was physically painful. My ears rang, my head pounded, my vision went blurry for a second. I think I might have actually blacked out for a split second. I know I gasped, a choked, involuntary sound that felt pitifully small against the sheer power of that roar. And then, with a sound that I will never forget, a sound that still replays in my nightmares, it jumped, it leapt. From right beside my tent, I heard the crash of underbrush, the snapping of larger branches, and then a splash, a massive echoing splash like a boulder being dropped into the lake. Silence. Just silence, except for the ringing in my ears and the frantic pounding of my heart. I lay there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, completely still, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. Slowly, the ringing in my ears faded. Slowly, my breathing started to even out, just a little. I cracked my eyes open, just a sliver. Darkness, just the black, impenetrable darkness of the forest night. I finally dared to sit up, slowly, cautiously. My muscles were stiff, my body was trembling, but I was alive, still alive. I reached out, unzipped the tent flap and peered out. Nothing, just trees, the faint glimmer of the lake in the distance, the cold night air. The campfire had long since burned out. I crawled out of the tent, stepping out into the silence. It was eerie, unnaturally quiet. Even the usual night sounds of the forest seemed to have gone silent. It was like the entire woods were holding its breath. I stood there for a long time, just listening, watching. I scanned the trees, the lake, the hillside, expecting something, anything. But there was nothing. No sound, no movement. Nothing to indicate that anything had just happened, that anything monstrous had been just yards away from me. Eventually, slowly, shakingly, I started to pack up my camp. Every rustle of a leaf made me jump. Every snap of a twig sent my heart racing again. But I forced myself to keep moving, keep packing. I needed to get out of there, needed to get back to my bike, back to the highway, back to somewhere else, anywhere else. By the time the first hint of dawn started to paint the sky, I was on my bike, engine roaring to life, tires spitting gravel as I tore out of that campground. I didn't stop riding until I was miles away, miles down the highway, miles away from Diablo Lake and Colonial Creek. I didn't look back, haven't been back since. And I know some people won't believe this. They'll say it was a bear, or a cougar, or just my imagination running wild. But I know what I heard, I know what I felt, and I know with a certainty that chills me to the bone that whatever was out there that night wasn't natural. It wasn't an animal. It was something else. And the worst part? It just vanished, jumped into the lake and disappeared. No tracks in the mud around the lake shore in the morning. No sign, no trace, nothing. Like it was never there. But it was. I know it was. And sometimes, in the quiet of night, I still hear that roar, and I remember that fear, that cold, paralyzing, gut-wrenching fear. And I wonder, what was it? And where did it go? And will it ever come back? I haven't camped alone in the woods since. Probably never will again. Some peace of mind just isn't worth the risk of facing that kind of terror again. Not ever. Story 14. It was still dark, that in-between dark and light that tricks your eyes into seeing things that aren't there, but this was there. I can still feel the chill that went right through me, colder than the river that morning. We were headed out to River Road, me and Samuel, early, real early. Fishing was supposed to be good after all that rain. End of spring, everything was green and overgrown, but the air still had that edge, you know, that damp spring chill that gets into your bones. Samuel, he's my brother-in-law. Good guy, but a worrier. He was going on about the river being too high, about debris, about whether the fish would even bite. I was half listening, just enjoying the quiet of the morning, the sound of the jeep chewing up the road, the air coming in through the windows, fresh, wet. We've been fishing that stretch of the Missouri for years, know it like the back of our hands. River roads mostly deserted at that hour, just farmhouses dotted here and there, fields stretching out to the river on one side, and woods climbing up the bluffs on the other. Then the road dipped, kind of curved to the left, and we were running alongside the river proper. The rain had been something else, days of it, and the Missouri was swollen, brown and angry looking, almost up to the road in places. Samuel was still talking, something about worms or lures or I don't even remember, when my headlights caught it. At first, I thought it was a deer. You know, sometimes they wander down to the river, especially at dawn, but deer don't stand like that. This thing, it was standing right on the riverbank, just at the edge of the trees, where the muddy water was licking at the grass. It was dark. I mean really dark, like it sucked the light right out of the air around it. And big. Jesus Christ, was it big. I slowed down, squinting through the windshield. Rain from the other day was still beading on the glass, blurring things a little. But this wasn't blurring, it was solid. I remember gripping the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles going white. Samuel had stopped talking too. I could feel him looking, feel the shift in the air in the Jeep. That sudden drop of temperature when you know something is wrong, terribly wrong. It stepped out onto the road, not walked, not ran, stepped. One massive leg came out of the trees, bent funny like a broken branch, and planted itself on the asphalt. Then the other one. It wasn't moving fast, but it was moving deliberate, like it knew exactly where it was going, exactly what it was doing. And that's when I saw it wasn't a deer, or anything human, or anything I'd ever seen, ever imagined. It was square. That's the first word that comes to mind, even now. Square. Like someone had taken a huge block of something dark and just shaped it roughly into a body. It was hunched over, but still towered over the hood of the Jeep. Easily 8 feet, maybe more. Wet. Soaked. Water was running off it in sheets, glistening in the headlight beams, but the darkness underneath, it just swallowed the light. It had one leg bent at this crazy angle, like its knee was backward or halfway up its thigh, and it was using that one leg to push itself up, out of the riverbed and onto the bank. The other leg was, I don't know, hidden in the shadows, but the way it was balanced on just that one bent leg, the sheer force it had to have to hoist itself out of that mud, it was unreal. Brute strength, like something mechanical, not living. We were still moving, slow now, but still creeping forward. I should have slammed on the brakes right then, put the Jeep in reverse, gotten the hell out of there. But I was frozen, staring, like a rabbit caught in headlights, except the headlights weren't just headlights, they were... I don't know what they were. They were showing me something I wasn't supposed to see. It turned its head, slowly. I couldn't make out a face, not really, just darkness again, shadows inside shadows. But I felt it see us. I felt its eyes, or whatever they were, lock onto the jeep. And there was nothing human there. No recognition, no curiosity, nothing familiar. Just something ancient, something wild, something predatory. My foot finally found the brake. I slammed it down. Tires screeched. The jeep lurched sideways, throwing Samuel against the door. He yelled, something garbled and scared. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. My breath was caught in my throat like I'd swallowed ice. The thing, it didn't even flinch. Didn't even seem to notice the noise, the screeching tires, the sudden stop just feet away. It was focused on getting out of the river. And once it was on the road, standing fully, impossibly upright, it just moved. It didn't run. It didn't walk. It bounded. Like a kangaroo, but 10 times bigger, 10 times heavier, 10 times more terrifying. That one bent leg, the one that looked broken, it was like a spring. It pushed off the asphalt with incredible power, sending it up and over the low embankment on the other side of the road. 1, 2, maybe 3 bounds. And it was gone. Into the trees. Vanished. Just like that. Silence. Just the engine idling, the hiss of the brakes cooling, the sound of the river rushing past, and my own heart hammering in my chest like it was trying to break free. I could feel the sweat prickling on my forehead, on my back, even though it was still cold outside. I looked at Samuel. He was staring straight ahead, his face pale, mouth open a little. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in the last 10 seconds. Did you see that? He finally whispered, his voice shaky. I just nodded, unable to speak. What do you say? What words are there for that? Did you see the 8-foot-tall, square, one-legged thing that just hopped across the road like it was nothing? It sounds insane, crazy, like something you'd read in a bad comic book. Samuel started talking then, a rush of words, trying to make sense of it, trying to fit it into something normal, something understandable. It was a bear, maybe, standing on its hind legs. Bears are big and wet, they can look different. He knew he didn't believe it. I knew he didn't believe it. We both knew what we'd seen. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything we knew. Or a deer, like you said at first, he went on, his voice getting weaker. A really big deer. And the angle. Maybe it just looked weird in the headlights. Samuel, I said, finally finding my voice. It sounded rough, like gravel. It wasn't a deer, and it wasn't a bear. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I think he saw it in my face, the fear, the absolute certainty. He saw that I knew, just like he knew, that what we'd seen wasn't of this world, at least not the world we knew. He swallowed hard. What was it then? I shook my head. I don't know. And that was the truth. I didn't know. I still don't know. We sat there for a long time, maybe 5 minutes, maybe 10. Neither of us moved, neither of us spoke, just the river, the engine, and the pounding of our own hearts. Then Samuel said very quietly, We should probably go. I nodded, put the jeep in drive and slowly pulled away. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep them on the wheel. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, but there was nothing there. Just the empty road, the trees, the river. Normal. Except it wasn't normal anymore. Not for me, not for Samuel. We didn't talk much on the way back to town, just small talk, meaningless stuff. We didn't even go fishing. We just turned around and went home. Samuel went to his place, and I went to mine. I didn't tell anyone for a long time. How could I? Who would believe me? My wife, Sarah, she'd just think I was crazy. Everyone would. Sasquatch? In Missouri? You must have been seeing things, Marcus. Too much coffee, not enough sleep. But I know what I saw. Samuel knows what he saw. We haven't talked about it much since that morning. Just a few words here and there, careful, hesitant, like we're both afraid to bring it back into the light, afraid of making it real again. But it is real. It was real. I saw it, felt it, smelled that wet, earthy, wild smell that lingered in the air after it was gone. And the tracks, the wet patches on the road, that's the only physical proof we had. 2 dark, damp spots on the dry asphalt, shaped kind of like footprints, but way too big and too wrong. They were gone by the time the sun was properly up, dried out by the morning air. Just gone, like it never happened. Except it did. I know it did. Sometimes, late at night, when I can't sleep, I think about it. Think about that dark shape in the headlights, that immense strength, that silent power. And I wonder what it was, where it came from, where it went. And I wonder if it's still out there, in the woods, watching, waiting. I've driven down River Road 1,000 times since then, always in daylight, never early morning, never at dawn. And every time I pass that spot, where it stepped out of the river, I get that same cold feeling in my stomach, that same prickle of fear on the back of my neck. It was just a glimpse, a split second of something that shouldn't exist, something that breaks the rules, something that makes you question everything you thought you knew about the world. And to this day, I can't explain it. I don't try to anymore. I just know. I know what I saw, and I know I'll never forget it. Story 15. Didn't even think about calling a cab or anything, just needed to move. Headed towards my sister's place. It was a long walk, especially from Sarah's, but I figured the fresh air would clear my head, and honestly, I just didn't want to be around anyone. West Nifong Boulevard, that's where I was walking, all the way down. Late, probably past midnight, and the whole place was deserted, except for the occasional car whipping past. Street lights were spaced out pretty far, so there were stretches that were just pitch black between them. You know how it is, those pools of light and then just darkness swallowing everything up again. The houses on either side were mostly dark too. People were asleep, tucked away from the cold. It felt really isolating, just me and the empty road and the biting wind. At first, it was just the usual feeling you get walking alone at night, a little bit on edge. But nothing too crazy. Just that low-level hum of maybe something could happen. But it started shifting, subtly at first. Like a prickle on the back of my neck, the kind you get when you think someone's looking at you, even if you can't see them. I told myself I was just being paranoid, still wired from the argument, probably overthinking everything. Tried to focus on just putting one foot in front of the other, the crunch of the snow under my boots, the way my breath puffed out in white clouds in front of my face. But the feeling didn't go away. It actually got stronger. It went from that prickle to this heavy weight pressing down on me, like I wasn't just walking alone anymore, like there was something else out there with me. It started as a whisper in the back of my mind, and then it grew into a full-blown shout of dread. I started noticing things out of the corner of my eye, just flickers of movement in the darkness beyond the streetlight beams. At first, I'd just glance over, thinking it was a shadow playing tricks, or maybe a deer. Colombia is kind of on the edge of things, still some woods around, even near town. Deer are everywhere, but these weren't deer movements. Too quick, too deliberate, and they were always in the shadows, just at the edge of my vision, like something was pacing me, keeping pace but staying just out of sight. I'd speed up a little, just naturally, without really thinking about it, and whatever it was seemed to speed up too. Still, just those glimpses, those flashes in the periphery, my heart started to pound harder, not just from walking fast, but from this creeping sense of something very wrong. My imagination started running wild, of course. Every stupid horror movie I'd ever seen flickered through my mind. I tried to tell myself it was stupid, that I was just spooking myself. Just nerves, exhaustion, too much stress. but the feeling was so real, so insistent. It wasn't just in my head. I could feel it, like a physical presence radiating out from the darkness beside the road, and it was getting closer. That's when I really started to hurry, almost a jog, then a full-on run. Adrenaline started pumping for real, pushing past the cold, the tiredness, everything. I just wanted to get to my sisters, to get inside, to get away from whatever was out there. I could hear my own breath coming in ragged gasps. The sound of my boots pounding on the sidewalk was deafening in the quiet night. And then I heard something else. It wasn't a sound I recognized at first, sort of a rustle but heavier than leaves in the wind, more like branches breaking, except there wasn't any wind, and the rustling, it was keeping pace with me. Even when I ran faster, it stayed right there, just off to the side in the dark. That's when pure terror slammed into me. Not just fear, but cold, gut-wrenching, primal terror. The kind that makes your legs weak and your stomach churn. I knew in that moment beyond any doubt that I was being followed, and it wasn't by anything normal. I couldn't keep running blind like that anymore. I had to know. Stupid, maybe, but I had to see what it was. I had to face it. I skidded to a stop, whirled around, and stared back into the darkness. For a second, there was nothing. Just blackness, the shadows of trees lining the road, the faint glow of the city in the distance. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it thumping in my ears. I held my breath, straining to see, to hear anything, and then I saw it. It was like the darkness itself was taking shape. At first, just a deeper shadow in the shadows, something massive and indistinct. And then it started to resolve, to solidify. Slowly, terrifyingly slowly, it came into focus. It was tall, unbelievably tall. Taller than any man I'd ever seen, taller than any tree nearby. I'd guess, looking back, at least 8 feet, maybe more. It stood upright like a man, but wrong. So wrong. The shoulders were massive, impossibly broad like a linebacker, but on steroids, and then some. I couldn't see its legs clearly. They were still mostly in shadow, but the upper body was unmistakable. Thick, powerful, covered in what looked like dark, matted fur. And then the head. That's what I'll never forget. It wasn't completely human, or completely animal. It was like some monstrous hybrid, a twisted mix of both. The face was simian, maybe, with a heavy brow ridge and a pushed-in nose. But the eyes were human-like, and they were fixed on me. They glowed faintly in the darkness, reflecting the little bit of light from the distant street lamp. And they were cold, empty, predatory. There was nothing human in them, no warmth, no understanding, just a chilling, malevolent intelligence. It didn't move for a long moment, just stood there, looming over me, a silent, terrifying statue in the dark. And then it made a sound. It wasn't a bark or a growl like any animal I knew. It was deeper, lower, more guttural, like something being dragged up from the depths of its chest. A harsh, rasping sound that vibrated in the cold air and seemed to vibrate in my bones. It was a warning, a clear, unmistakable threat. I was frozen, paralyzed. My mind was screaming, telling me to run, to fight, to do something, anything, but my body wouldn't move. Terror had locked me in place. I just stood there, staring up at this thing. Then slowly, deliberately, it took a step forward. Just one step, but it was enough. It closed the distance between us, and the sheer size of it became even more overwhelming. It was huge, bulky, easily 600 pounds, maybe more, like a mountain of muscle and fur and something else. The growl rumbled again, louder this time, closer. I could smell it then, a rank, musky odor that made my stomach heave, like wet dog and rotting meat, mixed with something wild, untamed. Something snapped in me then. The paralysis broke. Survival instinct kicked in. I didn't think, I just reacted. I turned and ran. I ran like I've never run before in my life. Didn't look back, didn't think, just pumped my legs and fled. The growl echoed behind me, but it didn't follow, at least not immediately. I kept running, my lungs burning, my legs aching, but adrenaline driving me on. I glanced over my shoulder once, maybe twice, but couldn't see anything in the dark. But I could still feel it, that sense of being watched, of being pursued. It was like it was imprinted on my senses now, this cold, heavy presence in the darkness behind me. Desperate, terrified, I fumbled for my phone, managed to unlock it, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. Stumbled through the menus to find Sarah's number, started texting her, just blurting out words, making no sense probably. "Something following me," I typed, my fingers clumsy and numb. "Big, monster, scared, Nifong, help." Stupid, frantic, useless messages. What could she do? But I just needed to reach out, to tell someone, to leave some kind of trace of what was happening. Maybe if something happened to me, maybe someone would find my phone, read the messages and understand something. I kept running, texting blindly, my eyes darting into the darkness, expecting to see it bursting out of the shadows any second. The cold air tore at my lungs, my muscles screamed, but I couldn't stop, couldn't slow down. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it was gone. The feeling lifted. The heavy presence, the sense of being watched, just vanished. 1 second it was there, suffocating, overwhelming. The next, nothing. Just the cold, empty night. Just the wind whistling through the trees. Just me, alone, on West Nifong Boulevard. I slowed to a walk, gasping for air, my body trembling from exhaustion and terror. I stopped under the next streetlight, leaned against the pole, and just stood there, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I looked back down the road, back into the darkness where I'd seen it. Nothing, just shadows, trees, the empty road stretching out behind me. It was like it had never been there, like I'd imagined the whole thing. Except, I knew I hadn't. I knew what I'd seen. I knew what had followed me. I could still feel the chill of those eyes, hear the rasp of that growl, smell that awful, sickening stench. It was real as the cold biting at my skin, as real as the pounding of my heart in my chest. I stayed there for a long time, huddled under the streetlight, shaking, trying to calm down. Sarah actually texted back eventually. Just, "What are you talking about? Are you okay?" I couldn't explain it in a text. Couldn't explain it at all, really. Just typed back, "I'm fine, just nothing. Forget it." And I kept walking. Got to my sister's place finally. Hours later, it felt like. She was asleep, of course. I let myself in, went straight to the couch and just collapsed. Didn't sleep much that night. Just lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, replaying it all in my head, over and over again. I've tried to rationalize it since then, tried to find some explanation, some way to make it fit into the world as I understand it. Maybe it was a bear. But bears aren't 8 feet tall, and they don't stand like men. Maybe it was a hallucination. Stress, exhaustion, whatever, but it felt so real.